The laughter hit her before she even reached the door. Elena Whitmore stood in the narrow hallway outside her father's study, her hand raised to knock. When she heard it, that particular sound her family made when they thought no one was listening, not the polite, measured laughter they performed for guests. This was something crueler, something that had her name buried inside it. She pressed her back against the wall and stayed very still. "Caleb Wilder wants Elena?" Her sister Margaret's voice, high and disbelieving. "The mountain man with half the Northern Territory rode all the way down here to ask for her?" Apparently, her father's voice was dry, amused. "He saw her somewhere, took a liking. That's the funniest thing I've heard in years." This was her mother. What could he possibly have seen? Richard Whitmore, her father, the man who had walked her through her first steps, who had once carried her on his shoulders at the county fair, laughed. A slow, rolling laugh, like this was the best joke the week had offered him. "Doesn't matter what he saw," he said. "What matters is we finally have a way to get her off our hands without it looking like we're throwing her away." Elena's hand dropped to her side. She did not move. She did not breathe. She stood in that hallway and let every word land exactly where it was aimed. If that were you, standing in that hallway, hearing your own family speak about you like a piece of furniture they finally found a buyer for, what would you do? This is the story of Elena Whitmore, the daughter nobody wanted, and the woman nobody saw coming. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where the people they threw away turn out to be the ones who mattered most, then subscribe to our channel. Hit the like button, and drop a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from. These stories have traveled further than we ever imagined, and we want to see how far this one goes. Don't go anywhere. You'll want to stay for every part of what happens next. The morning Caleb Wilder's letter arrived at the Whitmore household, Elena was already awake and working. She had been up since before 5, the way she usually was, because the Whitmore house ran on a quiet agreement that nobody ever stated out loud. The things that actually needed doing would be done by Elena. The good water hauled from the far side of the yard. The stove fed before the cold could settle into the kitchen. The linens that had been soaking overnight wrung out and hung before anyone else came downstairs expecting their day to begin smoothly. She didn't mind the work. That was the honest truth. She had tried to mind it once, years ago, when she was young enough to still compare herself to Margaret and Rose, her two sisters who slept until the light was already full and warm. She had stood in the kitchen with her hands red from the cold pump water and tried to feel the injustice of it. But somewhere along the way, the work had stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like the only thing in the house that was genuinely hers. When she fixed something, it stayed fixed. When she finished a task, it was done. There was a satisfaction in that she couldn't find anywhere else in the Whitmore home. She was carrying a bucket across the yard when she heard the horse, a single rider, coming fast up the road from the direction of town. Not the easy pace of someone out for a morning ride. This was a man with somewhere to be. She set the bucket down and watched him come through the front gate, a young hand from the postal office, his coat still damp from a morning ride through low fog. He asked for Mr. Whitmore. Elena told him her father wasn't awake yet. The young man hesitated, then handed the letter to her and said it had come all the way from the Northern Territories, marked urgent. Elena looked at the name on the outside. Whitmore family. Formal proposal of marriage. She set it on the kitchen table and went back to her work. She didn't think much about it. Marriage proposals came to the Whitmore house the way weather came, usually aimed at Margaret, occasionally at Rose, never with Elena's name anywhere near them. She was 26. In the valley, women her age who hadn't married were categorized quietly and permanently. Not unkind, the people of the valley, just practical. Elena had learned to live inside their practicality without letting it eat her alive. By the time her father came downstairs, she had the stove going and water heating and a full breakfast underway. He picked up the letter from the table without looking at her, broke the seal, and read it standing up in the kitchen with the smell of wood smoke and salt pork around him. She watched his face change. Richard Whitmore was not a man whose expressions moved much. He had trained himself over decades of land deals and disputes and the slow accumulation of a comfortable life to keep his reactions close to his chest. But something moved across his face as he read that letter. Surprise, then calculation, then something she couldn't quite name. "Margaret," he called toward the stairs. Rose, come down. He didn't call Elena. She was standing 8 feet from him. Her sisters came down in the unhurried way they always did, wrapped in their mourning things, Rose still braiding her hair, Margaret already asking what was so important it couldn't wait until after breakfast. Their father handed the letter to Margaret first, which was its own statement. Elena watched Margaret read it, watched her sister's eyes move down the page and then stop and then go back. Caleb Wilder, Margaret said slowly. You know who he is? Her father asked. Everyone knows who he is. He owns half the mountain range past the Crane River. They say his cattle operation runs further north than any other working ranch in the territory. Margaret looked up. He's asking to come visit, to formally propose. To whom? Rose asked, leaning in to look at the letter. Margaret's expression shifted into something careful. She looked at her father. He looked back at her with that same unreadable calm. Elena, Margaret said. The kitchen went quiet in a way kitchens rarely do. Elena had her back to them. She was turning the salt pork in the pan, keeping her attention on the fat and the heat the way her hands knew to do automatically. She didn't turn around, she waited. Elena, her father said. Not a question, not even really directed at her, more like he was testing the word in the air. He mentions her by name, Margaret said. She read from the letter. Miss Elena Whitmore, whom I had occasion to observe some years past during an incident in the town of Greer's Crossing. I was struck by her conduct and have not forgotten it. I write now to inquire whether she would consider my proposal and whether her family would receive me. Rose made a small sound that was almost a laugh, but dressed itself up as surprise. Elena finally turned around. Her father was looking at her in a way she recognized, the way people look at something that has suddenly and inconveniently become more complicated than they expected. Not with warmth, not with pride, with calculation. Do you know this man? He asked. I know of him, Elena said. Same as everyone. Do you know what he's referring to? Some incident in Greer's Crossing? She thought back. Greer's Crossing, years ago. She had been 17 or 18. There had been a situation in the market square here. An old man, a vendor who sold remedies and small goods, had been accused of theft by a merchant twice his size. The crowd had been willing to believe the merchant. It had been moving in a particular direction, that crowd, the ugly kind of direction crowds sometimes moved in when they found a target. Elena had stepped in front of the old man and told the crowd they were wrong. She hadn't done it because she was brave. She had done it because she was angry, and because the old man's hands were shaking, and because the merchant was lying. She had seen him pocket the item himself 20 minutes earlier. She'd said so, clearly and loudly, in front of everyone. The crowd had stopped. The merchant had gone red. The old man had walked away. She hadn't thought about it much afterward. It was just a thing that had needed doing. I remember, she told her father. He nodded slowly. He looked at the letter again, then folded it in half. I'll send a reply inviting him to visit, he said, and walked out of the kitchen. Margaret and Rose both looked at Elena. Rose's expression was the softer of the two. Curious, maybe even a touch sorry. Margaret's was something more complicated, a mixture of things Elena had spent a lifetime learning to read but never quite being able to name. Neither of them said anything. Elena turned back to the stove. Caleb Wilder arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks later, in a wagon that was clean but not ostentatious. The wagon of a man who had money and didn't feel the need to advertise it. He was larger than Elena had imagined from the letter. Broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent decades doing actual physical labor rather than managing other people doing it for them. His face had been weathered by altitude and wind into something that had given up on being young but hadn't surrendered to being old either. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she estimated. She watched him come through the gate from the upstairs window, the one that looked out over the front yard. She had been sent upstairs by her mother to change her dress. Not that one, her mother had said, looking her up and down with the practiced dissatisfaction she reserved specifically for Elena. The blue one. And do something with your hair. Elena had changed dresses. She had done something with her hair. She had looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin and seen what she always saw. A face that was honest rather than pretty, hands that were strong rather than delicate, a body built for function rather than display. She hadn't felt shame about this for several years now. She had graduated out of the shame into something quieter and more durable, a simple acknowledgement that she was what she was, and that was not nothing. She came downstairs when she was called. The family was arranged in the parlor, her father and mother in the good chairs, Margaret and Rose on the settee, everyone in their best clothes, everyone performing a version of themselves that had been polished for company. Caleb Wilder stood near the window, hat in hand, and he turned when Elena came in. She had expected him to look at her the way most people did on first assessment, with that brief, involuntary flicker of recalibration, the eyes moving over her and adjusting expectations downward. She had become so accustomed to that look that she barely registered it anymore. He didn't give her that look. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they recognize. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Wilder," she said. Her mother was already talking, filling the air with pleasantries and refreshments, and what a long journey it must have been, and Elena sat in the chair that had been left for her. The one slightly apart from the rest, she noticed, the arrangement of furniture itself communicating something about her position in this room. And she watched Caleb Wilder answer her mother's questions, and drink his tea and respond to her father's careful probings about land and cattle and the state of the Northern Territories. He was not a man who performed. That was the thing she noticed. Most men who came to the Whitmore house performing, presenting credentials, inflating their accomplishments, shaping themselves into whatever they thought the room wanted. Caleb Wilder answered questions directly and didn't embellish. When he didn't know something, he said so. When her father made a statement that wasn't quite accurate, he corrected it politely, but without backing down. Elena found herself paying closer attention than she had intended to. Later, when her mother had ushered Margaret and Rose into the kitchen under some thin pretext, and her father had excused himself for a moment, Elena was left alone in the parlor with Caleb Wilder for the first time. It was, she suspected, an arrangement her family had engineered, not out of kindness, but out of a desire to move this thing forward efficiently. "You don't remember me," she said. It wasn't a question. She couldn't imagine why he would. "I remember you very clearly," he said. She looked at him. "Greer's Crossing," he said. "You were wearing a green dress." The merchant's name was Dalton. He had the item in his own left coat pocket, and you told the whole square, so. The old man sold herbs and dried flowers. He paused. "I was standing at the back of the crowd. I saw the whole thing." Something strange moved through her, not quite warmth, more like the disorientation of being seen clearly by someone who had no reason to see you at all. "That was a long time ago," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was." There was a quiet that settled between them that wasn't uncomfortable. The fire in the parlor grate shifted. "I should tell you something," Elena said, "before this goes any further." He waited. "My family. They're pleased about this proposal, but not for the reasons a family is supposed to be pleased." She kept her voice even. "They're pleased because they consider this a convenient solution to a problem they've had for some years. The problem being me." She watched his face to see what this would do to it. It didn't do anything dramatic. He looked at her steadily, the way he had from the beginning. "Is that what you think you are?" he said. "A problem?" "I think I'm telling you the truth about the situation," she said, "so that you have it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I appreciate that. You may find after we've talked more that your proposal seems less sensible than it did when you wrote the letter," she said. "Or I may not," he said. Her father came back into the room and the conversation shifted back into formality, and Elena sat in her slightly apart chair and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something she couldn't quite name, that sat in her chest like a question waiting to be answered. It was 2 evenings after Caleb Wilder's visit that Elena stood in the hallway outside her father's study and heard everything. She had come to bring him the household accounts she'd finished tallying. She could hear voices inside, her parents, Margaret, Rose, and she raised her hand to knock, and then heard her own name in her sister's voice, full of disbelief and laughter, and she stopped. She stood with her hand raised, and she listened. She heard her father's slow, rolling amusement. She heard her mother say the words, "off our hands." She heard Margaret say that whatever Caleb Wilder thought he had seen, he hadn't seen it clearly, and that once he was actually living with Elena day to day, they'd be well clear of the problem and no one could blame them for it. She heard her father say, "We play this carefully. He's a wealthy man and he wants her, and that is the best luck this family has had in years. We don't question it. We get her out of here before he has a chance to think better of it." She heard her mother say, "She won't cause trouble. She never does." And there it was. The truest thing her mother had ever said about her, offered in a room with a closed door as evidence for why the plan would work. She never causes trouble. Elena lowered her hand from the door. She stood in the hallway with the account ledger against her chest and the sound of her family's laughter fading through the wood, and she waited for the feeling she expected, the collapse of something inside her, the old shame, the old ache of it. It didn't come. What came instead was something harder and cleaner. Not rage exactly. More like the moment a fever finally breaks and you lie in the damp sheets and know, with complete certainty, that you are not going to die of this. She had spent years waiting for her family to see her. She understood, standing in that hallway, that they had seen her. They had always seen her. They had simply decided that what they saw wasn't worth keeping. She turned and walked back down the hall. She put the account ledger on the kitchen table. She went upstairs to her room, sat down on the edge of her bed, and spent a long time looking at the floor. Then she made a decision. Not a decision born from anger. Not a decision born from hurt. A decision born from the very quality her mother had just described without knowing she was describing it. She was done causing no trouble. She was going to leave. She was going to leave on her own terms. And she was going to do it not because Caleb Wilder was a wealthy man with land in the Northern Territories, but because she was 26 years old and had spent every one of those years making a life for people who had just confirmed, through a closed door, that they had never considered her life worth making. She was going to go. She didn't know yet what she would find. She didn't know if Caleb Wilder was the man she had glimpsed in that parlor or something else entirely. She didn't know if the North was as cold and hard as people said, if the ranch would be a place she could make something of, if she would spend the rest of her life in another house where she was merely useful. She didn't know any of it. But she got up from the bed, crossed to the small desk by the window, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write. Not to her family, to Caleb Wilder. She wrote the way she did everything, directly, without decoration, without asking for anything she hadn't earned. She told him that she had considered his proposal. She told him that she intended to accept it. She told him that she wanted to be honest with him before she arrived at his door. She was not a gentle woman or a decorative one. She worked. She solved problems. She did not always say what people wanted to hear. She told him that if he was looking for those things, or if he was willing to find out what working beside someone like her might actually mean, then she would come north. She sealed the letter. She set it on the desk. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept through the whole night without waking once. Outside the window, the valley was going dark the way it always did, slow and complete, the mountains eating the last light from the west. The Whitmore house settled around her, creaking the way old houses do. She lay in the dark and she did not feel afraid. She felt, for the first time, like something was about to begin. Caleb Wilder's reply came 8 days after Elena sent her letter. She knew it was his before she picked it up from the table where the Morning Post had been left. The handwriting on the outside was the same as the original proposal, deliberate and unhurried, the letters of a man who had learned to write late and had practiced until he was good at it. She took it upstairs before anyone else came down for breakfast. She sat on the edge of her bed and opened it. He had written less than she expected, half a page, maybe a little more. He didn't address her points one by one the way a lawyer might, didn't qualify or negotiate. He said he had read her letter twice. He said that what she described, a woman who worked, who solved problems, who said what was true rather than what was easy, sounded to him like exactly what his ranch and his life had been missing. He said the North was cold and the work was hard, and there were days when the weather came in so fast and brutal that you couldn't see the barn from the house. He said he was not a smooth man or a gentle one, and that she should know that coming in. Then he wrote, "I have been waiting a long time to find someone worth being honest with. If you are that person, come north. If you arrive and find that you've made a mistake, I will arrange for you to return home. You have my word on that." Elena read the last part again. Then she folded the letter and put it in the small wooden box under her bed, where she kept the few things that were entirely her own. She went downstairs and made breakfast. Her mother came into the kitchen and asked if there had been any post. Elena said there had been a letter from Wilder. Her mother's face moved through 3 expressions in the space of a second. "And?" "I've written back to accept," Elena said. Her mother stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across her face that was almost something real, a flicker of something that might have been guilt or might have just been surprise that the transaction was proceeding so smoothly. "Well," her mother said, "that's settled then." "Yes," Elena said, "it is." She cracked an egg into the pan and didn't say anything else, and her mother went to call the others for breakfast, and the house carried on the way it always did. The journey north took 11 days. Her father arranged it, a hired coach as far as the relay station at Mallory Creek, then a transfer to a mail wagon heading up through the mountain passes toward the northern settlements. He made the arrangements efficiently and without much conversation, the way he handled business transactions. Her mother packed a trunk for her, selecting the items with the same careful practicality she brought to household management. Useful things, durable things, not the good linens or the silver-backed brushes that had come down from her grandmother. Elena didn't ask for those things. She packed her own additions, the account ledger she had been keeping for the household, because she understood numbers and wanted that knowledge with her. 3 books. The wooden box. A set of tools she had accumulated over years for repairs. A small hammer, a set of chisels, a coil of good rope. Things her mother would never have thought to include, and her father would have considered odd for a bride's trunk. The morning she left, her sisters came down to the yard. Rose hugged her. It was genuine, Rose's hug, brief and a little awkward because they had never been a particularly physical family, but genuine. She said, "Right when you get there." And her eyes were a little bright, and Elena believed she meant it. Margaret stood apart and watched. When Elena moved to pick up her bag, Margaret said, "Elena." Elena looked at her. Margaret opened her mouth and closed it again. Whatever she had been going to say, she didn't say it. She looked at the ground, then back up. "Be careful," she said finally. "The north is different." "I know," Elena said. She climbed into the coach. Her father gave the driver a nod. Her mother stood on the porch steps with her hands folded in front of her and her expression composed into something appropriate for the occasion. And as the coach pulled out of the yard and down the road, Elena looked back once. Her mother hadn't moved. She was still standing on the porch steps with her hands folded, watching the coach go. And her face in that last glimpse was not the face of a woman who was glad to be rid of something. It was the face of a woman who had just realized, one beat too late, that something irreversible had happened. Elena turned around and looked at the road ahead. She did not cry. She had already done whatever she was going to do about that, alone in her room on her last night in the Whitmore house, with the wooden box on the bed beside her and the sound of the valley settling into dark. She had used up whatever tears there were for the version of her life she was leaving behind. What was in front of her was still unknown. She was going to let it be unknown for a while and not try to manage it before she got there. The relay station at Mallory Creek smelled like horses and pine resin and the particular damp of mountain air that had never quite dried out. She had 4 hours to wait for the mail wagon. She sat on a bench outside the station with her trunk beside her and watched the traffic on the mountain road, freighters mostly, and a few families moving north with loaded wagons, and once a group of riders who came through fast and didn't stop. An older woman sat down on the bench beside her after a while. She had the look of someone who had been making this journey or versions of it for a long time, competent and weathered and entirely at ease with her own company. "You're headed north?" the woman asked. "I am," Elena said. "First time?" "Yes." The woman looked at her in the way people looked at you when they were deciding how much to say. "You got family up there?" "A husband," Elena said. It was the first time she had used the word. It felt strange in her mouth, not bad strange, but simply unfamiliar, like trying on a coat you hadn't worn before. "Rancher?" "Yes." The woman nodded slowly. "It's hard country," she said. "Beautiful, but hard. The winters come earlier than you think and stay longer. The spring mud will pull a wagon wheel down past the axle if you're not careful about where you drive." She paused. "You look like you can handle yourself, though." "I hope so," Elena said. The woman smiled at that, at the honest uncertainty of it, Elena thought, rather than at any false confidence. "You'll know soon enough," she said. "The North has a way of telling you what you're made of. Doesn't take long." The mail wagon came 2 hours later than expected, which the driver explained without apology as just the way things were on mountain roads. And Elena climbed up and settled her trunk and found her seat, and the wagon began to move north into country that grew wilder and more vertical with every mile. She arrived at Wilder Ranch on a Thursday afternoon, 7 days after leaving Mallory Creek. The approach came through a stand of pine that opened suddenly onto a broad valley. Not the valley she'd grown up in, with its settled farms and organized fences and the comfortable geometry of land that had been tamed for generations. This valley was larger and rawer, the mountains around it still wearing their authority without apology, the grasslands running in long, uneven sweeps that hadn't been broken by a plow. There were cattle in the middle distance, a dark, moving mass of them, and corrals and outbuildings arranged in the practical rather than aesthetic pattern of a working operation. The house itself was bigger than she'd expected. Not grand. It had been built by someone who understood function first and had added comfort as it became possible, so it had the slightly uneven look of a structure that had grown in stages. But it was solid. The chimney was drawing. The yard around it was not tidy, but it was organized, which Elena knew was a different and more useful thing. Caleb Wilder came out of the barn when the wagon stopped. He was wearing work clothes, his coat dark with whatever he'd been doing in the barn, and he had not apparently taken the time to clean up. This said something to her, and what it said was that he had not tried to manage her first impression of him. He'd kept working until the wagon arrived, and then he'd come out. He helped her down from the wagon. His hand was rough, and his grip was careful, the way of a man who knew his own strength and was paying attention to it. "You made it," he said. "I said I would," she said. Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, more like an internal adjustment, something settling into place. He had the look of a man who had been waiting to see if the person who showed up matched the person in the letter, and was now running that calculation. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Extremely," she said. He almost smiled then. "Come inside." The kitchen in the Wilder house had clearly been managed by whoever had most recently been willing to manage it, which appeared to have been a sequence of ranch hands and hired women who had none of Elena's interest in the actual function of a kitchen. The stove worked well enough. The supplies were adequate. The organization was the kind that had accumulated over years without anyone deciding what it was supposed to be. Elena ate what Caleb had prepared: salt pork and boiled potatoes, plain and hot, and exactly what she needed after 11 days of travel. And she looked around the kitchen while she ate and started mentally reorganizing it, the way she always did in a new space. Not as a desire to impose herself, but simply as the way her mind worked. She noticed where the light came in and what it didn't reach. She noticed the water situation, which required improvement. She noticed the draft near the back wall that would become a serious problem in winter. She noticed also that Caleb was watching her notice things. "You're doing an accounting," he said. "Is that all right?" "Depends on what you find," he said. "The water situation is manageable, but not good," she said. "The draft near the back wall will cost you heat all winter. Your supplies are adequate, but your organization makes them feel like less than they are." She paused. "None of that is unfixable." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How long did it take you to see all that?" "I came through the door about 2 hours ago," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, slowly, he said, "The woman I hired to run the house before you, she was here 8 months and never mentioned the draft." "Did you ask her?" "No." "There's your problem," Elena said. He laughed. Not a polite social laugh, but an actual one, short and a bit surprised, the kind that escapes before you decide to let it out. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected to find something in this man that could be reached that easily or honestly. "There probably is," he said. They ate the rest of the meal without filling the silence unnecessarily. Elena appreciated that. She had grown up in a house where silence was always being patched over with noise, as though quiet was something to be managed rather than simply occupied. Caleb Wilder appeared to have no discomfort with a room that wasn't talking. When they had finished, he showed her the house. Not the grand tour of a man presenting his accomplishments, but a practical walkthrough. Here is where things are. Here is what works and what doesn't. Here is what I haven't gotten to yet. He was honest about the second category. The room that would be hers had a window that stuck and a floorboard near the door that had started to give and would need to be seen to before snow season. "I'll see to the floorboard myself," she said. He stopped and looked at her. I have tools, she said. I brought them. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, all right. It was not the response of a man who was bothered by what she'd said. It was the response of a man who was still updating his understanding of who had arrived at his house. The first week was the hardest, though not in the ways she had anticipated. She had prepared herself for coldness, for the wary distance a man might maintain toward a woman he'd married on the basis of a letter and a memory. She had prepared herself for the possibility that the house would be hostile in the specific way of places that have settled into their own habits and resist interference. She had prepared herself for loneliness, which she knew something about. What she hadn't prepared herself for was the simple strangeness of occupying a life that wasn't yet hers. She was in the right place, she was doing the right things, she was talking to the right person, and yet nothing had the quality of belonging. It was like wearing clothes that fit in terms of measurements, but hadn't yet taken the shape of her body. She moved through the days with the careful efficiency she'd always had, and she did her work well, and she and Caleb were not unkind to each other, but she went to bed each night in the room with the fixed floorboard and the still sticking window, and felt the peculiar loneliness of a life not yet inhabited. She wrote to Rose. Not to the others, just to Rose, who had asked her to write. She kept the letter short. Arrived safely, the north is exactly as described. Cold comes on fast. She didn't write about the loneliness because it wasn't Rose's to carry, and she didn't write about Caleb because she hadn't figured out what to say about him yet. He was not what she'd expected, and she was still working out what he was. He worked from before dawn until well after dark most days. The operation he ran was larger than she had fully understood from the letter. Not just cattle, but a complex arrangement of grazing agreements with neighboring properties, a small timber operation on the north side of his land, and a growing network of agreements with other ranchers in the region that appeared to be moving towards something organized but wasn't quite there yet. She learned these things not from him directly, but from listening, from the conversations he had with his foreman and his hands, from the paperwork that accumulated on the desk in his office and that she could see through the open door when she passed. On the 8th day, she stopped in the doorway of his office. He was at the desk with a set of figures in front of him, frowning at them, with the look of a man who understood what the numbers meant, but found the numbers themselves uncooperative. "Can I help?" she said. He looked up. "With what?" "The figures," she said. "I kept the household accounts for my family for 6 years. I'm good with numbers." He looked at the papers on his desk, then at her. There was a moment where she could see him deciding something. Not whether she was capable, she thought, but whether to let her into a part of his operation that he hadn't offered. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He slid the papers across the desk. She looked at them for a few minutes without speaking, tracing the columns with her finger, following the logic of how the figures had been organized and where the organization had broken down. "You're losing track of the timber and the cattle separately and adding them together at the end," she said. "That's why the totals keep not matching what you expect. The timber income is irregular. It's masking the cattle pattern." He was quiet. "If you separate them and track them on different cycles," she said, "you'll be able to see which operation is actually performing and which is covering for the other." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her in a way she hadn't seen from him yet. Not assessing, not calculating, but something more direct than either of those. "The timber is covering for the cattle," he said. "That's what you're telling me." "I'm telling you I can't say for certain until the figures are separated," she said. "But yes, that's what it looks like." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "How long would that take you?" 3 days, she said. "Maybe 2. "Do it," he said. She finished in 2 days. She left the reorganized figures on his desk with a single page of notes explaining what she'd done and what the results showed. The cattle operation was running at a loss that the timber was masking. Not a catastrophic loss, but a real one, trending in a direction that would become catastrophic within 2 or 3 years if nothing changed. She didn't wait around to discuss it. She went back to her other work, the kitchen reorganization, and the water improvement she'd been planning, and the general project of learning the ranch's physical geography, which was vast enough that she hadn't come close to covering it in the first 2 weeks. He came and found her that evening. She was in the kitchen when she heard his boots on the floor, and then he was in the doorway with the notes in his hand. "You found it," he said. "It was there to find." "I've had 2 bookkeepers look at those figures in the past 3 years," he said. "Neither of them saw this." "They were looking at the totals," Elena said. I looked at the pieces. He was quiet. He set the notes on the kitchen table. He looked at them, then out the window at whatever was happening in the yard, then back at her. I have to make some decisions about the cattle operation, he said, about which sections of range are working and which aren't. It's going to affect how I use the grazing agreements with the neighbors. He paused. I'd like to talk it through with someone. I don't know cattle, she said. You know figures, he said, and you know how to look at pieces instead of totals. She wiped her hands on the cloth hanging from the stove bar and turned to face him fully. I was standing in the kitchen doorway looking at her with a directness she had come to recognize as simply the way he was. Not a performance of directness, but the real thing, the expression of a man who had spent too many years in country where pretense was too expensive to maintain. All right, she said. Tell me about the grazing. He pulled a chair from the table. She pulled one from the other side. They sat down in the kitchen with the fire going and the mountain cold pressing at the windows, and he began to talk about his land, and she began to ask the questions that occurred to her, and they talked for 3 hours without stopping. She learned more about the Northern Territory in those 3 hours than she had in all the reading she'd done beforehand. Not just the facts of it, the geography and the weather patterns, and the way the grass grew at altitude, but the texture of it, the particular difficulties of running an operation in land that gave you beauty and resources in the same motion it gave you hardship. He knew this land the way she knew the Whitmore household accounts, from the inside, from years of living inside the problem. And he listened to her questions as though they were worth answering. Not patiently, the way people listen to questions they're tolerating, but genuinely, as though her perspective from the outside of something he'd been inside for too long was actually useful to him. At some point, the fire had burned down low, and neither of them had noticed. It's late, he said, registering it. Yes, she said. He stood and banked the fire. She gathered the papers they'd been working through. There was a moment when they were both standing in the low-lit kitchen with the work between them on the table, and Elena was aware of something that hadn't been in the room at the beginning of the evening, a kind of ease, tentative and new, like the first solid ground after a long time on uncertain footing. You're not what I expected, he said. He didn't say it with apology or as a complaint. He said it like a fact he was acknowledging. What did you expect, she said. He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for the flattering version. Someone capable, he said. I knew that. I'd seen that. He paused. I didn't expect to find it useful. I thought it would be more... He stopped. Adjacent, she said. He looked at her. You expected someone capable who would manage things well, she said. In the house, with the accounts, alongside what you were doing, not in it. Yes, he said. That's closer to what I expected. And you find the alternative uncomfortable? She said. She wasn't asking to be difficult. She wanted to know. He thought about that too. He had a way of actually thinking before he answered that she was starting to recognize, and more than she'd expected, respect. No, he said. I find it surprising. Those aren't the same thing. She picked up the papers. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. She went to her room and set the papers on the desk and stood at the window that still stuck and looked out at the mountain dark, which was a different quality of dark than anything she'd grown up with. Deeper and more complete. The stars in it brighter and more numerous. The silence around them absolute in a way that could either be lonely or settling depending on where you stood. She realized she wasn't sure yet which of those it was, but for the first time since she'd arrived, she thought it might be settling. Well, the thing about ranch work was that it had no opinion about you. It needed doing whether you were confident or afraid, whether you felt like you belonged or like you were still learning the language of the place. The cattle needed water, and the fences needed checking, and the accounts needed keeping, and the kitchen needed running, and the winter stores needed to be assessed and supplemented, and all of it kept going regardless of the inner weather of the person doing it. Elena found this a relief. In the Whitmore house, every task she did had been visible in a particular way, noticed not as work, but as evidence of something, as proof of her utility, which was the only kind of belonging they'd offered her. Here, the work was just the work. It needed doing, and she did it, and then it needed doing again, and there was no one watching to see what it said about her. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when she met the nearest neighbors for the first time. The Hargrove family ran the property adjacent to Wilder Land on the eastern boundary, a smaller operation but a long-established one, the kind of family that had been in the north long enough to have opinions about the right way to do everything. The wife, Nora Hargrove, came with her eldest daughter on a Thursday afternoon, officially to welcome Elena, but actually, Elena understood within the first 10 minutes. To assess her, Nora Hargrove was a compact, observant woman in her late 40s who had the kind of face that gave away less than it took in. She drank her tea and asked Elena careful questions about where she was from and how she had come to be in the north. And Elena answered honestly and watched Nora recalibrate after each answer. "You kept your family's accounts," Nora said at one point. "For 6 years," Elena said. "And now Caleb's." "I'm helping with them, yes." Nora Hargrove looked at her with something that was almost, but not quite, approval. "The last woman who was in this house," she said, "was here 8 months and spent most of it complaining about the cold." "She mentioned the cold," Elena said. "Constantly. You haven't complained about the cold." "I've complained about the draft near the back wall," Elena said, "but I fixed that." Nora Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Then she put down her teacup and said, "My husband and Caleb have been discussing a joint water agreement for the past 2 years and gotten nowhere with it. What do you know about the water situation on this property?" It was an unusual thing to ask a woman she'd met 40 minutes ago. It was also a real question, asked as though the answer might actually matter. "I know the current water management is inadequate for what this operation needs to become," Elena said. "I have some ideas about improvement, but I haven't had time to work them out fully. What's the sticking point on the joint agreement?" Nora Hargrove looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "I think you and I are going to get along." The letter from her mother came 4 weeks after Elena arrived, and she almost didn't recognize the handwriting at first. She had never received a letter from her mother before, in 26 years. They had never been in different places long enough for that. It was short. Her mother's letters, she imagined, would always be short. It said that things at home were well enough, that Margaret had been seeing a young man from the county seat, that the weather had been poor, that she hoped Elena was settled. She didn't write back for 3 days. She tried once and stopped, and tried again and stopped, and on the third attempt wrote 3 careful paragraphs about the ranch and the weather and Nora Hargrove's visit, saying nothing that wasn't true and nothing that was the whole truth. She sealed it and gave it to the mail rider and stood in the yard watching him go and felt the odd arithmetic of it. That she was, in some sense, now in correspondence with her mother, which was a thing that had never happened when they lived under the same roof. Caleb came out of the barn and stopped beside her. "Letter going south?" he said. "To my mother." He looked at the rider disappearing around the tree line. "How is she?" "I don't know," Elena said honestly. "She says well enough. That usually means something else." He was quiet. She'd noticed that he didn't rush to fill silences, and that he had the specific discipline of a person who knows when someone is still working something out and is content to stand next to them while they do it. "My mother died when I was 11, he said. "Winter sickness. Quick." She looked at him. I was watching the road, not her, his hands in his coat pockets, his expression matter-of-fact in the way it got when he was saying something that still cost him something. "I'm sorry," she said. "Long time ago," he said. "Still," she said. He glanced at her sideways. There was something in his face she was learning to recognize. Not gratitude exactly, more like the expression of a man who wasn't accustomed to people simply acknowledging things without rushing past them. "Yes," he said quietly. "Still." They stood in the yard a moment longer, the mountain wind coming off the high slopes with the particular sharpness it had in the afternoons. And then he went back to the barn, and she went back to the kitchen, and nothing momentous had happened, and yet some small additional layer of ice had gone off the land between them, and the ground underneath was a little more solid than it had been. It was in the 5th week that the trouble arrived, though it came quietly enough at first that she almost missed it. She had been working on the water improvement. She had finally worked out a plan for redirecting the secondary runoff from the north slope to supplement the main water supply through the dry period between late summer and first snow. She'd sketched it out on paper and was working through the materials it would require when one of the ranch hands, a taciturn man named Briggs, who had been with the operation for years, came through the kitchen looking for Caleb. "He's in the east pasture," Elena said. "What is it?" Briggs looked at her with the mild discomfort of a man who wasn't sure yet what her role was supposed to be in this house, which she understood. She hadn't been here long enough for anyone to be certain of that. "Ryder came in from town," Briggs said. "Something about the land registry." Elena looked up from her sketch. "What about it?" "I don't know the details," Briggs said. "The Ryder's waiting in the yard. He's from the county assessor's office." She set down her pencil and went out to the yard. The Ryder was a young man she didn't know, with the look of someone who had been given a task he didn't entirely understand and was trying to discharge it efficiently. He had papers in his hand. He explained to Elena, since she was the person who had appeared, that there had been a filing at the county land registry disputing the eastern boundary of the Wilder property. A man named Garrett Cole, he said the name as though it might mean something to her, had filed a competing claim asserting that a portion of the Wilder land had originally been included in a separate purchase that had never been properly transferred to Wilder's title. Elena took the papers he was holding out. "Is this the filing?" she said. "A copy of it, ma'am." She read it. Her face stayed neutral while she read, which was a discipline she had spent years developing in a household where showing too much reaction had consequences. She read it twice to make sure she understood what she was actually looking at. "Where's Mr. Cole's claim based?" she said. "What documents is he citing?" "The original survey from 18 years ago," the writer said, sounding uncertain about whether he was supposed to be having this conversation with her. "I see," Elena said. "I can come back when Mr. Wilder—" "That won't be necessary," Elena said. "I'll take the papers." "Thank you." He left. She stood in the yard with the copy of the filing in her hand and looked at the eastern boundary of the land she could see from where she stood. And she thought about what she'd read, and she thought about the 3 hours she and Caleb had spent talking about his grazing agreements and the adjacent properties, and the long-standing informal understandings between the ranchers in this region. She went back inside. She got out the household papers, the documents Caleb had in the file box in his office, which he had shown her when she started on the accounts, and told her she could access as needed. She found the deed. She found the original purchase records. Then she sat down and began to read very carefully. By the time she heard Caleb's horse in the yard 2 hours later, she had what she needed. He came through the door with the particular energy of someone who'd been working outdoors all day and was about to want dinner, and he registered the papers spread across the kitchen table in Elena's expression and stopped. "What happened?" he said. "A man named Garrett Cole has filed a competing claim on approximately 80 acres of your eastern boundary," she said. "He's citing the original survey from 18 years ago." He stood very still. "Caleb," she said, "do you know what Cole's actual complaint is? Or whether he has a real claim?" "Cole's been trying to get access to the East Water Creek for 3 years, Caleb said. His voice had gone flat in the way she was beginning to associate with him being genuinely angry, but containing it. "He doesn't have a legal claim to it. It's inside my boundary." "I think you're right," Elena said. "But he's found something in the old survey, a notation that's ambiguous about the exact line at the point where the creek bends north. If someone argued it a certain way in front of a county judge—" "He doesn't have a case," Caleb said. "He might have enough of one to be a problem," Elena said carefully. "He doesn't need to win. He needs to be disruptive enough, for long enough, that you settle." Caleb looked at the papers on the table. He looked at her. Something was working behind his face. Not just anger at Cole, but something she thought might be the specific frustration of a man who had spent years building something and suddenly understood it could be undermined not by force, but by paperwork. "What do I need to do?" he said. "First thing," Elena said, "is find out if there's a second copy of the original survey. The one Cole's citing. There's a notation in it that could read 2 ways. But surveyors in that era usually made a field copy and a filed copy. If we can find both, we can compare them and see if the notation was a transcription error." He looked at her for a moment. "You read the survey," he said. "I read everything in the file box," she said. "How long would it take to find a second copy?" "I can write to the county surveyor's office tomorrow," she said, "and to the territorial archives if the county doesn't have it." He pulled out a chair from the table and sat down heavily, the day's work catching up to him now that he was still. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. "Cole has money," he said. "Not as much as he wants people to think, but enough to hire a lawyer and wait this out." "Then we find the survey," Elena said, "and we don't give him anything to wait out." He looked at her across the table with the papers between them. She wasn't sure what he was looking for. She kept her expression level and waited. "You've been here 5 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "And you're sitting here telling me how to defend my property." "Our property," she said, because it was true, and because she thought precision mattered in moments like this one. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. Nothing in Caleb Wilder was dramatic. But something moved. "Our property," he repeated. "If you'd rather handle it differently," she started. "No," he said. "Write the letter tomorrow." She nodded. She began gathering the papers into order, the survey copy on top, the deed underneath it, the original filing last. "Elena," he said. She looked up. He seemed to be searching for what he wanted to say, which was unusual for him. Usually he said things with a directness that didn't require much searching. "The woman I thought was coming here," he said slowly. "The one from the letter, I thought she was capable." "You've said that," she said. "I thought capable meant she'd manage things well," he said. "Keep the house. Handle the accounts." He paused. "I didn't think it meant she'd read my land records inside of 5 weeks and tell me where the problem was before I'd even seen the filing." Elena looked at him. "I wasn't hiding it from you," she said. "I just work the way I work." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm saying." The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the mountain dark was coming on fast the way it did at this altitude, swallowing the light before you'd fully registered that the afternoon had turned. "Get some rest," she said. "The letter will be ready in the morning." He stood, and as he passed the table, he paused for just a moment. Not long enough to become anything, just a beat where his hand rested on the edge of the table near the papers, near where her hand had been. And then he moved toward the hall, and she heard his boots on the stairs. She sat at the table a moment longer. The coal filing was a real problem. She had not minimized it to herself, even while she had presented it to him steadily. Garrett Cole had enough of a claim to be dangerous, and money enough to be patient, and patience in legal disputes was often more decisive than being right. But she had read the survey. And she had seen something in the notation that Cole's lawyer had perhaps seen first, but might not have seen completely. There was a possibility. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward herself and began to draft the letter to the county surveyor's office, her handwriting steady and precise in the lamplight, while the mountain wind pressed at the windows and the fire in the stove ticked and settled, and the ranch outside went quiet into another northern night. The letter to the county surveyor's office went out on a Friday morning, carried by the same mail rider who had brought the coal filing to the ranch 2 days earlier. Elena watched him go from the yard with the specific feeling of having set something in motion that couldn't be recalled, which was familiar to her. She had felt it when she sealed her letter to Caleb months ago, and before that when she'd stepped in front of that crowd in Greer's Crossing. The feeling wasn't comfortable exactly, but it was honest, and she had learned to trust it more than the comfort that came from doing nothing. She had written 2 letters, not one. The first to the county surveyor's office, requesting any field copies or secondary documents related to the original survey of the Wilder eastern boundary from 18 years prior. The second to the territorial archives office in the capital, requesting the same, framed as a title verification inquiry rather than a dispute response. She had thought about that framing carefully, because a dispute response would signal urgency, and urgency in legal matters had a way of attracting attention from people who hadn't yet noticed there was something worth paying attention to. Caleb had read both letters before she sealed them. He'd read them the way he read everything, all the way through without interrupting, then a second pass, then a question or two. The questions he asked told her what he understood and what he didn't, and what she found was that he understood the legal reasoning better than she'd expected and the archival logic less well, which was fair. It wasn't his area. "You're trying not to let Cole know we're looking for the field copy," he said. "If Cole's lawyer is good, they already know the field copy might exist," she said. "I'm trying to find it before they do, or at least at the same time. If we find it first, we control how it gets used." He nodded slowly. "And if the field copy says the same thing as the filed copy? Then we have a harder problem," she said. "But I don't think it will." "Why not?" "Because the notation in the filed copy has the look of a transcription error," she said. "The wording is inconsistent with the rest of the survey's language. Whoever copied it from the field document changed something, probably without realizing they were changing anything important. That kind of error almost always shows up when you compare the 2 versions." She paused. "I could be wrong." But you don't think you are, he said. I think I'm right, she said. I've been wrong before. He almost smiled at that. He was beginning to, she'd noticed, to almost smile at things she said that were honest in that particular dry way she had of being honest. She wasn't sure yet whether that meant something or whether it was simply the way a person responded to someone they were getting accustomed to. She went back inside, and he went to the east pasture, and the morning proceeded the way mornings on the ranch did, with the work absorbing everything and leaving no room for the kind of anticipatory anxiety she might otherwise have talked herself into. The reply from the county surveyor's office came back in 11 days, which was faster than she'd expected, and suggested either efficiency or alarm, and she wasn't sure which. It was efficient. The county surveyor's office had both copies. The field copy and the filed copy of the original survey were both on file in the county records room, and the clerk who had written back, a man named Eldridge, who seemed to have an actual interest in his work, had noted that he had compared the two documents upon receiving her inquiry and found a discrepancy in the eastern boundary notation that he considered significant. Elena read this paragraph 3 times. Then she read the rest of the letter, which contained a description of the discrepancy. The field copy, in the original surveyor's handwriting, clearly placed the boundary stake at a point that was 40 feet east of where the filed copy indicated. 40 feet, in land that contained a water source, was not nothing. She set the letter on the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment. 40 feet. The creek bend that Cole was claiming fell within the gap created by that 40 feet in the filed copy. In the field copy, the original, handwritten document made by the surveyor on the ground, it fell clearly within wilder land. She got up and went to find Caleb. He was in the barn, working on a piece of harness that had given out. She stood in the barn doorway and waited until he looked up. The field copy is different, she said. He set down the harness. She handed him the letter. He read it standing there in the barn with the smell of horses and hay around him and the light coming through the gaps in the boards. And she watched his face move through something. Relief, first, and then something more complicated. The look of a man who has been carrying a weight for long enough that its absence still felt uncertain. 40 feet, he said. The creek is inside your boundary, she said. In the original document, the filed copy was a transcription error. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Cole knows this? His lawyer may have found it, she said, or may not have looked hard enough. Either way, we have the information now. We need to get this to a lawyer, he said. Yes, she said. And we need to do it before Cole files anything further. The moment this becomes a formal legal dispute, it gets slower and more expensive regardless of who's right. He looked at the letter again. There's the man in Crane River, Aldous Fenn. He's handled property disputes for most of the ranchers up here. He's not cheap. How much not cheap? Caleb named a figure that was significant but not impossible. She had looked at his accounts thoroughly enough to know what was possible. Do it, she said. He looked at her. The alternative is a protracted dispute over land that is legally yours, she said. That costs more eventually, in money and in other things. He folded the letter. I'll ride to Crane River tomorrow. I'll write a summary of what we found, she said, so you have it organized when you talk to Fenn. He nodded. He picked up the harness again, then stopped. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to associate with something he was choosing to say, rather than something that just came out of him. When I sent that letter to your family, he said, I expected this to be simpler, in some ways. Simpler how? I expected to be the one managing the problems, he said. On my own, the way I always have, and someone else managing the house. Does it bother you? She said, not challenging him, genuinely asking. He thought about it, the real consideration she had come to expect from him, the pause that wasn't hesitation but actual thought. No, he said, but it's different from what I expected. Different good or different requiring adjustment? He looked at her with a directness that was not unkind. Both, he said. She accepted that as the honest thing it was and went back to the house to write the summary for Aldous Fenn. Caleb came back from Crane River 2 days later with Fenn's assessment, which confirmed what Elena had already concluded. The field copy, once formally introduced as evidence of the original survey intent, would effectively nullify Cole's claim. The transcription error in the filed copy had been the basis of Cole's entire argument, and without it, there was no argument. Fenn's advice was to move immediately. File the field copy comparison with the county land registry as a clarification of existing title. Get it into the official record before Cole could complicate the picture further, and send Cole's lawyer a formal notice that the claim had no foundation. Elena wrote the formal documentation request that evening while Caleb drafted the letter to Cole's lawyer under Fenn's guidance. They worked at opposite ends of the kitchen table, the lamp between them, and at one point she looked up and found him watching her write. "You write fast," he said. "I've written a lot of correspondence," she said. "Your family's?" "6 years of it," she said. "Letters to creditors, letters to suppliers, letters to people my father owed and people who owed him. He was better at acquiring obligations than managing them." He was quiet for a moment. "He didn't know you were handling it?" "He knew," she said. "He just preferred not to think about it directly." She went back to writing. He was quiet. "Elena," he said after a while. She looked up. "What you told me the first day," he said, "about why your family was glad to have you go." She waited. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "About what kind of people—" He stopped. Started again. "I keep trying to understand how they looked at what they had and decided it was a problem." She set down her pen. The kitchen was very quiet, the fire low, the mountain outside doing whatever mountains did in the dark. "They needed someone to do the work," she said carefully. "And they had me. But needing something and valuing it are different. They needed the work done and they resented needing it, and it was easier to resent me than to resent the situation." "That's a generous reading of it," he said. "It's a practical one," she said. "I stopped trying to find the generous reading a long time ago. This one makes more sense." He looked at her with something in his face that wasn't pity. She would have closed off immediately at pity. But something quieter and more specific, the expression of a man confronting a fact that sat badly with him. "Their loss," he said. He said it simply, without weight, the way you state something you've concluded. She picked up her pen. "Yes," she said. "It is." They finished their letters and went to bed, and the next morning Caleb rode out to the eastern boundary alone, and she knew without asking that he was going to look at the 40 feet of land that had almost been taken from him, the way a person needs to look at a close call with their own eyes before it becomes fully real. The Cole situation resolved more quickly than Elena had expected and less cleanly than she had hoped, which was generally how these things went. Garrett Cole, upon receiving Fenn's formal notice, did not withdraw his claim immediately. He held on for another 3 weeks, during which his lawyer wrote 2 letters that were increasingly theatrical and increasingly thin on actual legal substance. Elena read both letters and told Caleb what they said without dressing it up. Cole was stalling because he'd realized he'd lost but hadn't yet decided to admit it, and men in that position could be unpredictable. Cole was not unpredictable in any dangerous way. He was predictable in the specific way of men who had expected to win something and hadn't. He became unpleasant in small, visible ways. He let a section of his fence on the boundary line fall into disrepair and didn't fix it, which let 3 of his cattle wander onto wilder land. He stopped at the general store in the nearest settlement, a small cluster of buildings called Ridgeton, and told people that Caleb had found a technicality in the paperwork and used it to cheat him. This was the part that bothered Elena more than the legal dispute itself. She heard about it from Nora Hargrove, who came by on a Thursday with her daughter, and the kind of carefully neutral expression that meant she was carrying information she wasn't sure how to deliver. "Cole's been talking," Nora said. "I know," Elena said. She put the kettle on. "He's saying Caleb manipulated the survey records." Nora said it directly, which Elena had come to appreciate about her. "People who don't know the situation are listening." "What are people who do know the situation saying?" Nora considered. "That Cole's been trying to get at that creek for years, and he finally found a way to try for it legally, and it didn't work out." "Is that the prevailing view?" "For most people," Nora said. "There are a few who aren't sure." Elena poured the tea. "What would it take to make them sure?" Nora looked at her. "Showing the documents to people who can understand them isn't practical," she said. "Most people around here would rather trust their judgment of a person than read a land survey." "Then the question is their judgment of Caleb," Elena said. "And now you," Nora said, looking at her steadily. "You've been here 2 months. People have opinions." "What kind of opinions?" "Mixed," Nora said honestly. "Some people think Caleb found himself a capable woman, and that's a good thing. Some people think a woman running her husband's books and his legal correspondence is unusual. Unusual is a kind word, Elena said. I'm being kind, Nora said. But Elena, the people who are uncertain about you aren't your enemies. They're people who don't know you yet, and in a place like this, the way you handle what's in front of you is how you get known. Elena drank her tea. She looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the particular quality of northern light that had taken her time to adjust to. Harder and more direct than the valley light she'd grown up with, not softer. What would you do? She said. Nora thought about it. The Ridgeton community meeting is next month, she said. People bring proposals for road improvements, water access, boundary matters. It's where things get worked out in the open. She paused. Caleb hasn't attended in 2 years. He's never found those meetings useful. But if he went, and if you went, with the water improvement plan you've been working on, Elena looked at her. What water improvement plan? She said, though she already knew the answer to her own question. The one you were talking to my husband about, Nora said, with the slight smile of a woman who had been waiting to deploy this. He came home and told me you'd been asking him questions about the community water situation and that you had ideas. He seemed impressed, which for Edmund is saying something. Elena set down her cup. She had talked to Edmund Hargrove twice since Nora's first visit. Once when he'd come to look at the fence situation on the boundary between the properties, and once when she'd gone over to the Hargrove place to return a borrowed implement and ended up in a long conversation about the creek system and how it functioned downstream. Edmund Hargrove was a careful, slow-talking man who had forgotten more about northern water management than most people would ever know, and talking to him had expanded what she understood about the water plan considerably. She had not thought of it as anything more than a conversation until now. The plan isn't ready, she said. How close is it to ready? She thought about it honestly. 4 weeks, she said. Maybe 6. The community meeting is in 5 weeks, Nora said. She pushed harder on the water plan than she had been, which meant working on it in the evenings after the day's other work was done, which meant fewer hours of sleep, which she accepted as the cost of the deadline without complaint, though she was aware of the cost. Caleb noticed. He came into the kitchen one evening and found her still at the table at what must have been 11 o'clock, the lamp burning low and the paper spread around her, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said anything. Elena. She looked up. You've been up past midnight 4 nights running, he said. How do you know? The lamp in the kitchen is visible from the bunkhouse, he said. Briggs mentioned it. She looked back at her papers. The meeting is in 3 weeks. He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and sat down across from her. He looked at the papers, at the maps she had sketched and the calculations and the proposal she had been drafting. He had the ability to read technical documents without having to be told what he was looking at, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He was quiet while he read. You're proposing a shared maintenance agreement for the secondary creek system, he said, between the Wilder property, the Hargrove property, and, he looked at the map, the Vickers property north of the creek bend, and any other landowner who uses. The problem isn't any individual property's water management. It's that everyone manages their section independently, and the decisions made upstream affect what's available downstream, and nobody has a system for working that out before it becomes a dispute. He looked at the proposal. This would require people to agree to a set of maintenance standards, he said. Yes. And a shared cost for any infrastructure improvements. Proportional to use, she said. I've drafted a formula. He looked at the formula. She watched him follow the logic of it. Vickers won't like the north section assessment, he said. Vickers uses the north section more than his share of the water, she said. The formula is proportional to use. If he doesn't like the assessment, he's welcome to use less water. Caleb almost smiled. Nora thinks bringing this to the community meeting will help, Elena said. With what Cole has been saying. He set the papers down. He looked at her directly. Is that why you're doing it? He said. Not accusingly, genuinely asking. She considered the question seriously. Partly, she said. The water problem is real and the plan is good. I'd want to bring it regardless. But yes, the timing is also deliberate. You're trying to solve 2 things at once, he said. When I can, she said. Yes. He was quiet. Something was working behind his face that she couldn't fully read. When I wrote to your family, he said, I told them I was looking for someone with courage and honesty. He paused. I didn't. He stopped. She waited. I understood those things as separate from intelligence, he said. I thought a person could have one without the other. Courage without necessarily being strategic. Honest without necessarily being. He was choosing words carefully, which was unusual for him. This. What is this? She said. He looked at her. Someone who sees the whole of a thing, he said, not just the part in front of her. The kitchen was quiet. The fire had burned down to coals. Is that a problem? She said. She meant it honestly, not as a challenge, but as a real question. She had seen marriages where the wife's intelligence was tolerated in private and managed in public, and she needed to know if she had walked into that kind of arrangement without meaning to. No, he said. There was no hesitation in it. It's not a problem. She looked at him. Elena, he said, I am not a man who would spend his life uncomfortable with being matched. The words landed with a weight she hadn't expected. She held them for a moment, the way you hold something that turns out to be heavier than it looks. All right, she said. Go to sleep, he said. The plan will still be here in the morning. She gathered the papers and straightened them and set them at the end of the table. When she stood, she was more tired than she'd realized, the kind of tired that had been accumulating for days without her paying attention to it. Thank you, she said. She didn't specify what for. She thought he knew. Good night, he said. The community meeting at Ridgeton was held in the assembly hall above the general store on a Thursday evening in late autumn, 6 weeks after Elena had sent the first letter to the county surveyor's office and a world away in terms of what she understood about where she was and who she was in it. She had been to Ridgeton 3 times before this, twice for supplies, and once to visit a woman named Clara Marsh, who had sent word that she was ill and had no family nearby. She had gone the second time, partly because Nora had mentioned it, and partly because it seemed like the thing to do, and she had sat with Clara Marsh for 2 hours and helped her organize what needed organizing in her house, and left her with a supply of the willow bark preparation she kept on hand. Clara had looked at her when she was leaving with the expression of someone who had expected less than they received and wasn't sure what to do with the difference. That was 3 weeks ago. She hadn't thought much about it. At the community meeting, she found out that Clara had told people about it. She didn't find this out directly. She found it out the way you find most things out in small communities, from the texture of how people received her when she and Caleb walked in. There were people who had heard Cole's version of the land dispute and were visibly making a reassessment. There were people who greeted Caleb with a warmth she hadn't seen in the more formal context she'd observed him in. And there were people who greeted her, specifically her, with the combination of curiosity and something tentative that she recognized as the early stage of a community deciding whether to include someone. Garrett Cole was there. He stood at the far end of the room with 2 other men, and he looked at Caleb when they came in with the compressed expression of a man who had lost something and was not graceful about it. He did not look at Elena directly. She found that telling. The meeting proceeded through several items before she was given the floor: road maintenance, a dispute about fence responsibilities between 2 properties on the North Road, a proposal from the general store owner about coordinating supply orders to reduce costs. The people who ran the meeting were efficient in the particular way of people who had been doing it long enough that they had stopped making it more formal than necessary. When Caleb introduced the water proposal, he introduced it plainly. His wife had identified a systematic problem with the secondary creek management and had developed a proposal for addressing it, and he'd asked her to present it. There was a shift in the room when she stood up. Not hostile, more like an adjustment, the recalibration of attention. She had 30 people looking at her, some curious, some skeptical. Nora Hargrove in the 3rd row with a carefully neutral expression that contained actual encouragement, and Garrett Cole at the back making a particular effort to look unimpressed. She had thought about how to present it. She had thought about whether to lead with the technical analysis or the practical impact. She had decided to lead with the thing everyone in the room already knew and hadn't been able to fix. The past 3 dry seasons, at least 4 properties in this community have had disputes about water access that could have been avoided, she said. Not because anyone was acting in bad faith, because decisions made upstream by one landowner affect availability downstream for others, and there's currently no agreement about how those decisions get made. She paused. This proposal doesn't take anything away from anyone. It creates a shared framework for making the decisions that need to be made anyway, with input from everyone affected before it becomes a crisis. She walked through the main points without dwelling on any of them longer than necessary. She had learned in 6 years of managing the Whitmore household's correspondence that people stopped listening when you explained things past the point they'd already understood. She watched the room while she talked, the way she always watched rooms. Not for approval, but for information about where the resistance was and what it was actually about. The resistance, when it came from 2 places. Vickers, as Caleb had predicted, objected to the North Section assessment, and a man named Howard Pratt, who had a small property on the far east side of the community, raised a concern about whether a maintenance agreement would create legal obligations he didn't understand. She addressed Vickers directly, with the numbers in front of her, and she was patient with it because she could see he was uncomfortable being challenged in a public room and that pushing too hard would produce stubbornness regardless of the logic. She gave him a partial concession, a review provision after the first year that would allow any assessment to be revisited based on actual measured use, and she watched him recalculate. She addressed Pratt's concern by simplifying the language of the relevant section on the spot, rewriting it in a sentence, which she thought was probably the most useful thing she did in the entire meeting. At the end, there were questions. Some were practical, some were skeptical, and one was a genuine expression of interest from a man who had been quietly listening the whole time and turned out to have thought about the creek system for years without having the mathematical framework to formalize it. She answered all of them. When it was done, Caleb stood beside her while people came forward to look at the written proposal she'd laid out on the table at the front of the room. He didn't say anything, which was right. This was not the moment for anything to be said. But she was aware of him standing there in the specific way she'd become aware of him in the past weeks. His physical solidity, the steadiness of him, the way he occupied space without demanding it. Nora appeared at her elbow. "Vickers," Nora murmured. Elena looked. Vickers was at the table, reading the proposal. His expression was no longer actively resistant. "The review provision," Elena said quietly. "Gave him a way to say yes without backing down completely," Nora said. "That was well done." "I've had practice," Elena said. Nora looked at her sideways. "With whom?" "My father," Elena said. "He was the same way." Nora made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "God help us, they're everywhere." On the way home, Caleb and Elena rode side by side through the mountain dark without speaking for a long time. The road back to the ranch was one she had made enough times now that she knew its character. The long, flat section after the creek crossing, the rise through the pines that always smelled stronger at night, the final slope down into the valley where the ranch lights were visible from a quarter-mile. "Cole said something to me," Caleb said. They were in the pine section. She waited. "On the way out," Caleb said. He said he hoped I understood that no woman running her husband's business in front of the whole community was doing him any favors. The pines moved around them in the wind. "What did you say?" she said. "I told him my wife wasn't running my business," Caleb said. "I told him she was running half of it, same as I was, and that if he had an opinion about that, he could keep it, because I wasn't interested." She absorbed this. "He wasn't expecting that," she said. "No," Caleb said. He wasn't. They came in out of the pines and the ranch was visible ahead, the lamp she'd left burning in the kitchen window, a point of amber light in the dark. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what I said," he said, "in the kitchen, about being matched." He paused. The horses moved beneath them at the same pace, their breath visible in the cold. "I want you to know I meant it. Not as a thing I was saying to make you feel better." "I know," she said. "You do?" "You don't say things to make people feel better," she said. "You say things when you mean them. I noticed that early." He was quiet for a moment. "What else did you notice early?" She thought about it. "That you work until the light is gone and then come in and don't expect anyone to have been waiting," she said. "That you answer questions with what you actually think rather than what you expect people want to hear. That you correct things that are wrong even when it would be easier not to." She paused. "That you were genuinely, not just theoretically, looking for someone to be honest with." The ranch gate was ahead of them now, the familiar creak of it in the wind. "And?" he said. He was asking for more, she realized. Not greedily, but carefully, the way you ask for something you're not sure you're allowed to want. And I think you are exactly what you presented yourself as, she said, which is rarer than it should be. He reached the gate first and leaned from his horse to open it without dismounting, a practiced motion she had watched him make 100 times. He held it for her and she passed through, and he came through after and let it swing closed. They rode into the yard. The kitchen light was warm in the window. "I owe you something," he said when they'd stopped. She looked at him. "What?" "An honest accounting," he said. He dismounted and turned to face her, and his expression in the lamplight from the window was the most direct she had seen it, not the professional directness of a man discussing land or accounts, but something more personal and therefore more effortful. "When I chose you, I told myself I chose you because of what I saw in Greer's Crossing. Your courage. That was true. But it wasn't complete." She waited. "I also chose you," he said, "because your family had the kind of money that would have attracted attention, and your sisters had the kind of looks that would have attracted attention, and I was tired of attention." He stopped. "I thought choosing you would be quieter." She looked at him. "That's a fairly insulting thing to tell someone," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's why I'm telling you now instead of never, which would have been easier." She sat with it. She could feel the various ways she could receive this. With anger, which would have been reasonable. With hurt, which was also available to her. Or with the clear-eyed assessment that this was a man doing exactly what he had just told her he could be relied upon to do, which was say the true thing even when it cost him. "You got what you deserved," she said finally. He blinked. "You thought you were choosing quiet," she said, "and you got me." A pause. "That seems like a fair outcome." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else she had a word for, and then it settled into the expression she'd come to associate with him, having concluded something that he'd been working out for a while. "It does," he said. "Yes." He took the horses to the barn. She went inside and hung up her coat and set the kettle on, and she stood in the kitchen that had become, sometime in the past 2 months without her marking the exact moment, a place she recognized as hers, and she thought about what he had said. She had spent 26 years in a house where people had seen exactly what she was and decided it wasn't worth keeping. She had walked north expecting to find either the same thing in a different location or something she couldn't predict. What she had found was a man complicated enough to be both thoughtless and honest about it. That was, she thought, much closer to something real than anything she had grown up expecting. She heard his boots on the porch. The door opened. "Tea?" she said. "Please," he said. He sat at the table. She poured. And outside, the mountain dark did what it always did, pressed close and total and indifferent, while inside the lamp burned and the fire ticked, and the water plan sat at the end of the table waiting for signatures that she was fairly certain were coming. She was not the unwanted daughter of the Whitmore family anymore. She wasn't sure exactly what she was yet. This life was still new, still uneven under her feet, still in the process of becoming something she didn't have a full name for. But she was here. She had made herself here, one fixed floorboard and one reorganized ledger and one community meeting at a time. And that, she had learned, was how belonging actually worked. Not as a thing you were given, but as a thing you built, piece by careful piece, until one day you looked up and found that you were already inside it. The water agreement was signed by 7 landowners before the first snow came. It had not been 7 at the meeting. It had been 4. Caleb, Edmund Hargrove, a rancher named Tesler, who had a property 2 miles north of the creek bend. And after a week of quiet deliberation, Vickers, who had written to Elena directly with a list of additional questions about the review provision and had apparently found her answers satisfactory enough to commit. The other 3 came in during the 2 weeks following, word having traveled. The way word traveled in the northern settlements, not through any announcement, but through the particular efficiency of people who talked to their neighbors and had been watching the same problem for years without anyone offering a framework for solving it. Edmund Hargrove told Caleb that the water agreement was the first community arrangement of its kind in the North Territory. He said it in the way of a man reporting a fact rather than offering a compliment, which made it more useful than any version dressed up as praise. Elena filed the signed agreement with the county land registry in the same package as the final resolution documents from the coal dispute. She had decided to do it that way deliberately, put both things in the record at once, the problem that had been attempted against this property and the community project that had come out of the same period. Not as a statement, just as an accurate account of what had happened. The county clerk who processed the filing sent back a note that said only, "Documents received and recorded, 14th November. But 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Aldous Fenn in Crane River, saying he had heard about the water agreement and that he had 3 clients in other parts of the territory, dealing with similar creek management disputes, and would Elena be willing to correspond with him about the methodology. She wrote back the same day. She told him she'd be glad to, and that the framework was adaptable, and that she had a few refinements she'd been thinking about since the Ridgeton meeting that she could share once she'd worked them out properly. She did not tell Caleb about the letter for 3 days. Not because she was hiding it, but because she was still processing what it meant. That the thing she had built in 3 weeks of late-night work at the kitchen table was now being asked about by a lawyer who had other clients with the same problem. She needed to hold that information in her own hands for a little while before she shared it. When she did tell him, he read Fenn's letter twice and then set it on the desk and looked at it. "He wants your methodology," he said. "He wants to know if it's transferable," she said. "Is it?" "I think so," she said, "with adjustments for different water systems." He was quiet for a moment. "You could charge for that," he said. She looked at him. "Consultation," he said. "If Fenn has 3 clients with the same problem, there are others. What you worked out isn't... Most people couldn't have done it." She had not thought about it in those terms. She had thought about it as a problem she solved because it needed solving, the way she thought about most things. The idea that the solution had value that existed separately from the problem it had addressed was a different angle entirely. "I'd have to think about that," she said. "Think about it," he said simply, and went back to what he'd been doing. She did think about it. For several days she thought about it in the background of everything else. The way she processed most things that mattered. Not by sitting still and deliberating, but by letting it run alongside the daily work until enough pieces had fallen into place that she knew what she thought. What she concluded by the end of the week was that Caleb was right, and that the version of herself that had arrived at this ranch 7 months ago would not have been able to see that he was right, because that version of herself had not yet learned to separate the value of the work from the question of whether anyone would recognize it. She wrote to Fenn with a consulting fee included in the letter. A modest one, because she was genuinely uncertain about the market for such a thing and didn't want to price herself out of finding out. She framed it as a standard professional arrangement and sent the letter before she could talk herself into making it smaller. Winter arrived in the north the way the old woman at the Mallory Creek relay station had warned her it would, faster than you expected, and more completely. It did not come in gradually. One morning, Elena woke to find the world outside the window. A different place than it had been the night before. The yard and the pastures and the distant tree line, all under a uniform whiteness that had settled in the dark without announcement. She stood at the window for a long moment. She had seen snow before. The valley had its winter weeks. But not like this. Not this much. Not this quiet. Not this absolute in the way it changed what was possible and what wasn't. She lit the stove and started the morning and began adjusting. The adjustments were significant. The water plan's infrastructure, partially implemented before the freeze, needed monitoring through the winter to ensure the maintenance agreements were holding at each property. The cattle operation shifted to a completely different set of demands. Supplemental feeding, daily checks on the herd, the particular vigilance of watching animals through months when small problems could become disasters quickly. The accounts shifted too, winter having a different cost structure than the other seasons in ways Elena was still learning. She learned them. She made mistakes, ordered the wrong quantity of a supplement and had to correct it, made an assumption about the insulation in the north-facing storage room that turned out to be wrong, and cost them a portion of the winter stores before she caught it, misjudged the timeline on a fence repair, and had to send Briggs out in conditions that were worse than they should have been. She owned each mistake directly and fixed it without drama, which she thought was probably the most important thing. Not the mistakes themselves, but the not letting them accumulate into a story about her competence or lack of it. Caleb made mistakes too. He pushed the herd into the north section a week too early in December, reading the weather wrong, and lost 2 days correcting the decision. He disagreed with Elena about the winter accounts in a way that got sharp before it got resolved, both of them sitting at the kitchen table with the same figures interpreted differently, neither willing to concede the point until Briggs came in, and with complete disinterest in the argument, supplied a piece of information that confirmed Elena's reading. Caleb accepted the correction without difficulty and without lingering on it, which she thought said more about him than any of the things he'd done that she already admired. "You weren't wrong about the logic," she said after. "I was wrong about the figures," he said. That's the part that matters." "The logic was good, though," she said. "If the figures had been what you thought—" "They weren't," he said. "I know. I'm saying your reasoning was sound, just the input was off." He looked at her. "Why are you defending my mistake?" "I'm not defending it," she said. "I'm being accurate about it. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You do that a lot." "What?" "Make sure people get credit for what they actually did," he said, "even when they got the outcome wrong." She thought about that. "I grew up in a house where people got blamed for outcomes regardless of whether their reasoning was sound," she said. "It leaves you with an opinion about accuracy." He nodded slowly. Understood, she thought, more of what she meant than the surface of the words. Rose's letter came in January, on a day when the snow had been coming down steadily for 36 hours, and the light was the flat gray of deep winter, and Elena had been indoors long enough to feel the particular cabin weight of it. She read it at the kitchen table while the stove worked hard against the cold outside. Rose wrote the way she had always been, warm and a little scattered and genuinely fond in the way that had always been real, even when Elena had sometimes been too exhausted by the rest of her family to fully receive it. She wrote about Margaret's young man from the county seat, who was apparently still present and apparently serious. She wrote about their mother, who had taken to spending more time in the front parlor in the evenings than she used to, sitting with needlework instead of joining conversations, which Rose described as strange, and which Elena understood, from the description, as something closer to her mother sitting with her own thoughts for the first time in a long time. Near the end of the letter, Rose wrote, "Father has had some difficulties this winter. I don't want to alarm you, but I think you should know. Some of his arrangements have not gone as planned. He has been quieter than usual. Margaret says not to worry and that he will manage it. I don't know. He looks older than he did when you left." Elena read that paragraph 3 times. She set the letter down. She looked out the window at the snow. She had thought about her father intermittently since leaving, not with longing and not with sustained anger, but the way you think about a wound that is healed into a scar, present and permanent, but no longer demanding attention. She had not expected to feel, reading Rose's careful understatement, the specific quality of worry that came now. Not for the situation particularly. For her father, the person, whom she knew well enough to understand that a man like Richard Whitmore going quiet was a different and more serious thing than a man like him making noise about his troubles. She wrote back to Rose that evening. She asked, carefully and directly, what kind of difficulties. She asked for the specifics, because she knew Rose would soften them, and she needed them unsoftened. She told Rose to write back as soon as she could. She didn't tell Caleb about the letter that night. She told him the next morning, over breakfast, straightforwardly. Her sister had written, her father had encountered financial difficulties of some unclear kind. She was waiting for more information. He listened without interrupting. "Is there anything you need to do about it now?" he said. "Not until I know more," she said. "All right," he said. He didn't press. He didn't offer unsolicited opinions about her family, which she had come to understand was its own form of respect. He trusted her to manage what was hers to manage without requiring him to have a position on it. Rose's second letter came 3 weeks later, and it was less careful than the first. Their father had made a series of investments over the past 2 years in a land development scheme in the southern counties. The scheme had collapsed. Fraud, according to what Rose had gathered from conversations she wasn't supposed to be overhearing, the same way Elena had gathered information in that house, by being present and quiet and paying attention. The man at the center of it had disappeared. Richard Whitmore had not been the only investor, but he had put in significantly more than most. And what he had put in was, as Rose understood it, gone. The Whitmore house was not in immediate danger. They still had the property and the land, and some income from tenant arrangements. But the comfortable life that Richard Whitmore had built over 30 years, the life that had included hired help and new furnishings, and the social standing that came from visible prosperity, that was contracting, had already contracted, was continuing to contract. And Rose wrote at the end, "Father has mentioned you twice in the past month, not in a way I can easily describe. He doesn't say much, but he mentions you." Elena put the letter in the wooden box under her bed. She sat on the edge of the bed in the winter room with the stuck window she had never gotten around to fixing because it had been frozen shut since November, and the problem had become irrelevant, and she held the information inside herself for a long time. She knew what was coming. Not when, not in what form exactly, but the shape of it was clear enough. Her father had lost significantly, her family's situation had diminished, and Richard Whitmore, who had spent a lifetime solving problems through the people available to him, was thinking about his daughter who had married into the Northern Territories. She thought about how she felt about that. She expected to feel the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction of having been right, of having left and built something while they remained behind and declined. That satisfaction was available, she could feel the edge of it. But underneath it was something less simple, which was the reality of people she knew being in a reduced situation, and the specific reality of her father being diminished, which was not something she had wanted even when she had every reason to want it. She didn't talk to Caleb about it that evening. She made dinner and they ate and talked about the cattle and the water agreement's performance through the winter, and a proposal that Tesla had sent about extending the arrangement to a Fourth Creek tributary. She went to bed and lay in the dark and decided that she would wait until it became necessary to decide something. What Rose had told her was information, not yet a request. She would hold it until it became more than that. It became more than that 6 weeks later, in early March, when the snow was beginning to release its grip on the north in the slow, reluctant way it always did at altitude, and the first pale evidence of coming spring was showing in the lower pastures. A letter arrived from her father, the first letter he had ever written to her directly, in 26 years. It was not a long letter. Richard Whitmore was not a man who did the difficult thing with more words than necessary. She had always known that about him. It was a quality she recognized in herself, that particular economy with language in high-stakes situations. He wrote that he hoped she was well. He wrote that he assumed she had heard something of the family's recent circumstances. He wrote that he was not asking for charity and would not accept it. He wrote that he was asking, and she could feel the cost of the word as she read it, the particular cost to a man like him of writing asking, whether Caleb might have any interest in a business arrangement that could benefit both parties. He had land. He knew people in the southern counties. Caleb had an operation that appeared, from what Rose said, to be expanding. He thought there might be a conversation worth having. He signed it, "Your father, Richard Whitmore." Not love, not affection, just the plain statement of relation, which was, from him, more honest than any of the softer alternatives would have been. She set the letter on the kitchen table. She sat across from it for a while. Then she got up and went to find Caleb, who was in the barn going over the equipment they'd be needing once the ground was soft enough to work. She stood in the barn doorway, the same position she'd stood in months ago to tell him about the county surveyor's reply, and she waited until he looked up. "My father wrote," she said, "directly to me." He set down what he was holding. He came to where she was standing. She gave him the letter. He read it. His face was unreadable in the way it got when he was taking something seriously. "He wants a business arrangement," Caleb said. "That's what he says." "What do you think he actually wants?" She had thought about this. "He wants a lifeline," she said. "A business arrangement is the form he can accept. He's not capable of asking for help directly, but he's capable of proposing something that might happen to help, if it also makes sense on other terms." Caleb looked at the letter again. "Is there actually a proposition here that makes sense on other terms?" "He has land in the south," Elena said, "and connections. He knew everyone in that county for 30 years. The connections are probably worth more than he realizes right now because his estimation of himself has taken a significant blow." She paused. "You've been talking to Fenn about whether there's a secondary market for northern cattle in the southern counties. The right introduction there could be worth something real." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "Since Rose's first letter," she said. "I didn't know if it would become relevant, and now it has." "Yes." He walked back into the barn and stood looking at the equipment arrayed around him. She waited. She knew his silences by now. This was the kind where he was genuinely working something out and would say something real at the end of it. "How do you feel about it?" he said. His back was to her. "I feel several things," she said. "I feel the pull to refuse, because of what they said, what they did." She was quiet for a moment. "I also feel that refusing because of that is making this about me, rather than about what the right thing is." He turned around. "And what's the right thing?" he said. "I don't know if helping him is the right thing," she said honestly. "He made choices that led to this. He's not a victim of bad luck. He trusted someone he shouldn't have and lost money he shouldn't have put at risk, and his family is paying for it." She paused. "But withholding help that costs us very little and could stabilize 4 people's lives, including Rose, who never did anything wrong, because I'm angry at my father seems like punishing the wrong people." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll write to Fenn," he said, "about the Southern market. If there's a real proposition there, I'll consider it on its merits." "That's all I'm asking," she said. "That's not nothing, Elena," he said. "Your father came to you after what he did. That took something from him." "I know," she said. "That's part of why I'm not refusing outright." He nodded. He picked up what he'd been working on. She went back to the house. She wrote to her father that afternoon. She told him that Caleb was looking into the Southern market question and that if there was a genuine proposition to be had, he would be in contact through proper channels. She told him she was glad he had written. She did not tell him she forgave him, because she wasn't sure yet what she forgave and what she didn't, and she was not willing to say something that wasn't exactly true, not even to smooth over a difficult situation. She told him the North was cold, but that the cold had turned out to be manageable. She sealed the letter. She sat with her hand on it for a moment. Then she put it in the outgoing post pile and went back to the accounts. Spring in the Northern Territory was not the gentle warming of the valley she'd grown up in. It was argumentative, cold days that had apparently forgotten they were supposed to be receding, mud that went deeper than anyone remembered from the year before, the creek system doing complicated things as the snowmelt came off the mountains all at once, and the maintenance agreement got its first real test in conditions that were nothing like the dry season scenario it had been designed for. The agreement held. Not perfectly. There were 2 properties where the new drainage channels overwhelmed what had been planned, and she spent 3 days in early April riding out to those properties with the landowners and working through the adjustments on site, in mud and cold that made the meetings more honest, if not more comfortable. Edmund Hargrove's eldest son, a young man of about 20 who had apparently inherited his father's observational nature but not his reticence, helped her work through the drainage adjustment on the Hargrove property. When they were done, he looked at the adjusted calculations and said, with the specific candor of someone too young to think it required diplomacy, "How did you learn all this?" "I didn't have it when I got here," Elena said. "I worked it out." He considered this. "From nothing?" "From the pieces that were available," she said. "The old surveyor records, your father's knowledge of the water system, what I knew about drainage from a completely different context." She looked at the adjusted channel they'd dug that afternoon. "Most problems are made of pieces that are already there. You just have to find the right way to put them together." He thought about that. "My father says you're the reason the agreement happened at all." "Your father was generous," she said. "The agreement happened because 7 people decided the problem was worth solving." "He says without you they'd still be deciding," the boy said. She didn't answer that. She put on her coat and picked up the tools. The letter from Aldous Fenn about the Southern market arrived in late April, and it was more substantial than Elena had expected. Fenn had done his own investigation, apparently taking the question seriously enough to look into it beyond what she'd asked. And what he'd found was that there was a real and underserved demand for quality northern cattle in 3 of the southern counties, a demand that had been met inconsistently by a patchwork of small operators and would respond well to a reliable, larger supplier. Richard Whitmore's name appeared in the letter. Fenn had looked into the southern county connections Elena had mentioned and had found that Whitmore, despite his current difficulties, still had relationships with the buyers who mattered and the stockyard operators who controlled access. His reputation had been damaged by the failed investment scheme, but not destroyed, because the failure had been obviously external rather than a product of his own dishonesty, and people who had known him for 30 years were willing to extend him some patience. The proposition, as Fenn laid it out, was real. Whitmore's connections and local knowledge in exchange for wilder cattle and the logistical capacity to fulfill actual orders. A commission structure that rewarded performance. a formal agreement that protected both parties. She read the letter twice and made notes in the margin and then took it to Caleb. He read it more slowly than he read most things. She watched him. Fen thinks it's viable, he said. Fen is careful, she said. He wouldn't have written this if he had doubts. Your father would be working for us, essentially, Caleb said. That's not a small thing for a man like him to accept. No, she said, it isn't. Has he accepted it? He doesn't know the specifics yet, she said. I wanted to know if it was worth pursuing before I told him what it might look like. Caleb set the letter on the desk. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was something she had learned he did when he was making a final assessment of something he'd been considering for a while. Elena, he said, if we do this, your father is going to be in our business life, not just someone you write to. I know, she said. That's different from helping him from a distance. I know, she said again. If you don't want that, I understand. This is your operation. Our operation, he said, the same correction she had made months ago in the opposite direction, and hearing it from him now had a weight it wouldn't have had then. She waited. Let me meet him, Caleb said. Before we decide anything, let him come north. She had not expected that. You want to meet him? I want to know who I'm doing business with, he said. And I want him to see what you've built here. He paused, and something in his face was very deliberate, very considered. I think he should see it. She understood what he meant. Not as a cruelty, not as a display designed to make Richard Whitmore feel the full weight of his error, but as a reality that would need to be present in any relationship that came after. Before her father could be useful to this ranch, he would need to understand what this ranch was. And before he could understand what this ranch was, he would need to understand who Elena was inside it. I'll write to him, she said. She wrote the letter that evening. She told her father that Caleb was interested in discussing the southern market arrangement, that there appeared to be genuine mutual benefit, and that the first step would be for Richard to come north so they could speak in person. She told him the journey was 11 days by coach and wagon. She told him at the end simply, there is a great deal here that you have not seen. I think it would be useful for you to see it. She did not dress it up. She did not prepare him or soften it. She sent it the next morning. Well, the reply took 2 weeks. She had wondered whether it would come at all. She knew her father well enough to know that the invitation to come north, to come to his daughter's house as a supplicant, essentially, whatever the business framing, was a significant thing to ask of him. She had not known, sending the letter, whether he was capable of it. He was. He wrote that he would come in late May, when the roads were passable and the worst of the spring mud had settled. He wrote that he was grateful for the consideration. He wrote, and this was the sentence she read 3 times, the way she always read the sentences that were doing the most work. Your mother sends her regards and says she hopes the winter was not too hard. Her mother had dictated a sentence for inclusion in her father's letter. Elena sat with that for a long time. The Lydia Whitmore she had grown up with did not send regards through other people's letters. She managed communications directly, or she let them go. A sentence inserted into her husband's correspondence was, from Lydia Whitmore, something close to an entirely different kind of communication, an acknowledgement that the direct route was not available to her, and that she was willing to use an indirect one rather than say nothing at all. She showed Caleb the letter at dinner that evening, pointing to the sentence. He read it. He looked up at her. Your mother. Yes, she said. What does that mean? She thought about it for a moment. It means she's been sitting in the parlor with her needlework, Elena said, and thinking. He nodded slowly. He handed the letter back to her. That night, after he had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table for a while with the lamp low. She thought about the parlor in the Whitmore house, and her mother in it, and the creaking quiet of a house where the thing they had dismissed had turned out to be the thing they couldn't replace. She thought about standing in that hallway with the account ledger against her chest, hearing laughter through a closed door. She thought about the morning she had left, her mother on the porch steps with her hands folded, watching the coach. She got out a sheet of paper. She wrote a letter to her mother, not through her father, directly. She asked about the needlework, which was a safe question and therefore a real one. She said the winter had been hard, but that the house was warm and the work was good. She said she was looking forward to her father's visit. She stopped before adding anything else because there was nothing else that was ready to be said yet. and she had learned, at some cost, the difference between the truth that was ready and the truth that needed more time. She sealed it. She set it with the outgoing post. Outside, the northern spring was pressing at the edges of the cold, tentative and determined, the way springs were up here. Not asking permission, just arriving, 1 degree and one mud-softened field at a time, until one morning you woke up and the world was beginning again, whether you had prepared for it or not. She put out the lamp and went to bed and lay in the dark listening to the silence that had stopped being lonely. Sometime in the months that had passed without her marking the exact moment, and she thought about late May and her father coming north and the look she imagined on his face when he came through the gate and saw what his daughter had made of the life he had been so relieved to send her away from. She did not feel triumph about that exactly, but she did not feel nothing either. She felt like a woman who had gone a long way from where she started and found that the distance, measured honestly, was entirely to her benefit. She fell asleep while the wind came off the mountains with the smell of snowmelt and new earth in it, and the ranch settled around her the way it always did, solid and imperfect and hers. Richard Whitmore arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in the last week of May, 11 days after Elena had sent the coach directions south through Fenn's office in Crane River. She saw the hired wagon coming down the road from the pine stand before it reached the gate, the same vantage point from which she had once watched Caleb's approach back in those early weeks when everything about this place was still foreign to her. She was in the yard checking the water channel that ran along the north side of the house, part of the secondary system she'd implemented over the winter, now flowing clean and steady with the snowmelt that was still coming off the high slopes in thin silver threads. She straightened when she saw the wagon and stood where she was and waited. Caleb came out of the barn. He had known the approximate arrival window and had, without being asked, found something to do in the barn that would bring him naturally to the yard at the right moment. She had noticed that about him over the months, his instinct for being present without making his presence into a statement. The wagon came through the gate. Her father looked smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing, and it surprised her even though she had been trying to prepare herself for some version of it. Richard Whitmore had always occupied a room with a particular solidity, the physical confidence of a man who had spent decades being the largest presence in most spaces he entered. The man who climbed down from the wagon with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been arguing with 11 days of travel was recognizably her father. The same square face, the same deliberate way of settling his weight. But something in the scale of him had shifted. He looked at the ranch. His eyes moved across the yard, the house, the corrals, the barn, the pastures beyond, with the assessment of a man who had spent his life evaluating properties. She watched him do it and watched his face as he did, because she knew what he was looking for, and she wanted to see the moment he found it. The moment came when his gaze reached the water channel along the north wall. He looked at it for a beat longer than he'd looked at anything else. Then he looked at Elena. "You built that," he said. Not a question. "The infrastructure, yes," she said. "It's part of a community water agreement covering 7 properties." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the channel again. Then he looked at Caleb, who had come to stand beside Elena with the natural ease of someone who belonged exactly where he was standing. "Mr. Whitmore," Caleb said. He extended his hand. Her father shook it. "Mr. Wilder." A pause. "You have a serious operation here." "We've been building it," Caleb said. He said "we" without emphasis and without looking at Elena, which was exactly right. Her father looked at her. His expression was not the one she had imagined in various versions of this moment over the months since Rose's first letter. She had imagined contrition or pride managed into neutrality, or the specific discomfort of a man confronting the evidence of a mistake. What she saw instead was something simpler and harder to categorize, a man looking at his daughter and finding her in a context that did not match any version of her he had held in his mind. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. "Come inside. You need to eat something and warm up." She turned and went in, and she heard the 2 men following her, and she heard her father say something to Caleb about the road conditions south of Mallory Creek, and she heard Caleb answer in the direct, easy way he had with strangers he was still deciding about, and something in her chest settled into a position she hadn't known it had been away from. The first evening was careful in the way first evenings usually are when the people at the table have too much history between them that hasn't yet been spoken out loud. She had made a proper dinner, not elaborate, because elaborate would have been performing for him, and she was done performing for her father. But good, the kind of meal the kitchen was capable of now that she understood its resources and its limitations. The salt pork was from their own herd. The bread had been baked that morning. The preserved vegetables were from the cellar she had organized in the fall. Her father ate with the attention of a man who had not had a good meal recently. She watched him without making it obvious. Caleb talked about the operation, the cattle, the timber, the grazing agreements, the secondary market question that had brought Richard here in the first place. He was straightforward about it, giving her father the real picture rather than a managed version of it, and she noticed her father respond to this with a visible calibration, the slight relaxation of a man who has been prepared for salesmanship and is relieved to find something else. "You've spoken with Fenn," her father said. "At length," Caleb said. "His assessment of the southern market aligns with what you described in your letter. The demand is real." "It is," her father said. He had both hands around his coffee cup. "3 of the stockyard operators I know have been complaining for 2 years about the inconsistency of their supply. They're willing to pay a premium for reliability." He paused. "I can give you those introductions. I still have enough standing with those men that the introduction will mean something." "I'm aware of that," Caleb said. Her father looked at him. "I asked around," Caleb said simply. "Before you came. I wanted to know who I was talking to." A small silence. "And?" her father said. "People who have known you 30 years say you're a man who honors his agreements," Caleb said. "That counts for a great deal with me." Her father set down his cup. He looked at the table for a moment, and Elena had the strange experience of watching her father manage something, some internal weight that had risen at Caleb's words, with an effort she could see. Richard Whitmore was not a man who showed effort. "The investment scheme," her father said. "You know about that." "The general outline," Caleb said. "I was careless," her father said. He said it with the flat clarity of a man who had been over the same ground enough times that the self-justifications had all worn out. "I was impatient. I trusted a man I should have investigated more thoroughly because I liked his manner and his projections, and I didn't want to slow down and look harder." He paused. "I've looked harder since." "I expect you have," Caleb said. There was something in the room then that Elena hadn't expected, a quality of 2 men measuring each other without pretense, the conversation stripped of the performance layer that usually accompanied first meetings between men of business. She thought it had something to do with Caleb's particular refusal to manage situations through social lubrication, which had the effect of bringing other people to the same unadorned register, whether they intended to or not. After dinner, Caleb excused himself. Something to check in the barn, he said, which was probably true and was also a thing she hadn't asked him to do, but which gave her and her father the first time alone since the wagon had come through the gate. They sat at the kitchen table with the fire going down to coals. Her father looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother sent the wrong things in your trunk." She looked at him. "When you left," he said, "she packed practical things. She left out the silver-backed brushes from your grandmother. She left out the good linens." He paused. "I didn't notice until afterward, when I was in the room." She was quiet. "I should have caught it," he said. "Father," she said. He looked up. "I didn't want those things," she said. "Not then. I wanted to come here without anything that was about being a Whitmore." She paused. The wooden box and the tools were right, for what I needed. He looked at her steadily. "The wooden box," he said. "You've always had that box." "Since I was 10, she said. "You made it." Something crossed his face that was almost imperceptible and therefore very loud. "I remember," he said. The fire ticked. Outside, the northern evening was doing what it did, settling into a clear, cold dark that was nothing like the valley dark she'd grown up in, the stars harder and more numerous. "Elena," he said, "what I said, what your mother said, in the study." He stopped. He had apparently decided he was going to say this and was discovering it was harder than he'd planned. "We didn't know you were in the hallway." "I know," she said. "If we had—" "You would have said it differently," she said. "Not differently enough, but differently." He was quiet. "I'm not telling you that to punish you," she said. "I'm telling you because I think you should know that I know the difference between a careful version and the real thing." She looked at him. I know what you thought of me. What we thought we knew, he said. That's not... He stopped again, started again more carefully. What we thought isn't what we found out. She held that for a moment. No, she said finally, it isn't. He nodded. He looked at the table. He was not going to cry. Richard Whitmore had not cried in her presence a single time in 26 years, but there was something happening in his face that was in the same territory. Rose misses you, he said, moving to safer ground. I miss her, Elena said honestly. Tell her to come north sometime, when the roads are better. She'd like that, he said. And Margaret, Elena said, how is she? Better than she deserves to be, her father said, with a dryness that was so entirely the father she'd grown up with that she almost laughed, and his mouth moved in the same direction at the same moment. And for a brief instant, they were just two people who knew the same person well and had exactly the same opinion of her. It passed, but it had been there. The business discussions took 3 days. She was present for all of them, which her father had not initially expected. She could see that in the slight adjustment he made, the first morning when she sat down at the table with the papers and her notes, and it became clear she was not there to serve coffee. He adjusted without comment, which she thought was its own evidence of change. The proposition, as it developed over those 3 days, was sound. Richard Whitmore would provide introductions and ongoing relationship management with 3 key buyers in the southern counties, leveraging connections he had built over 3 decades, and that remained intact despite the failed investment scheme. Caleb would provide a guaranteed minimum supply of northern cattle per season, with quality specifications that Elena had drafted based on what she'd learned about the buyer's stated requirements from Fenn's research. The commission structure she had worked out was fair to both parties and included a performance review at the end of the first full season. On the second day, her father made a suggestion about the commission structure that was better than what she'd drafted. She said so directly, revised the document, and watched him register the directness with something that took her a moment to identify. He recognized it. He had seen her be direct before, but she had been direct her whole life. But he was seeing it now from the other side of a table where it was aimed at work they were doing together. Rather than at household management, he didn't consider her territory. Where did you learn to draft agreements? He said. From watching you do it wrong, she said, and then immediately was not sure whether that had been too much. But her father made a sound that was almost a laugh. Fair, he said. On the third afternoon, they signed the agreement. Caleb and Richard Whitmore and Elena, all 3 of them, because Fenn had advised that if Elena's consultation work was going to be a component of the operation, which it now formally was, after the second Fenn letter and the 3 other inquiries that had come in from landowners in adjacent territories, her name should be in the relevant documents as a party rather than a background actor. Her father looked at her name on the document for a moment before he signed. Fenn told me about the water agreement, he said, and the surveyor situation. Fenn talks a great deal, Elena said. He said you'd found the discrepancy in the filed copy. Yes. How? Because I read the whole document instead of just the section that seemed relevant, she said. The language was inconsistent with the rest of the survey. It stood out once I was looking at the whole. Her father looked at the document in front of him. Then he picked up the pen and signed, and the thing was done. Well, he stayed 4 more days after the agreement was signed. Less formal days, without the structure of the business discussions, and therefore in some ways harder and in other ways easier. He walked the property with Caleb on the second of those days, and Elena watched them from the kitchen window, 2 men moving across the pasture toward the east boundary, her husband pointing at something in the middle distance, her father looking where he pointed. She had no idea what they were saying. She didn't try to imagine it. On the third day, she took him to see the water channel system, the full system, not just the house section. They rode out together in the morning with the spring air still sharp enough to require a coat, and she showed him the primary diversion point and the maintenance structures and the boundary markers where the agreement with the adjacent properties was physically documented in the landscape. He was quiet for most of it. He asked 2 questions, both technical, and she answered them. At the end, standing at the creek bend where the water moved through the new channel with the sound of something that had found its proper direction, he said, "You built this in your first winter here." "I planned it in the first 2 months," she said. "We implemented it in stages. With no formal training. With what I could find out," she said. Edmund Hargrove knows this water system better than anyone. I asked him a lot of questions. Her father looked at the creek. He looked at the channel. He looked at the way the water moved. I used to think, he said slowly, that the qualities you had, the ones your mother and I— He stopped, started again. I used to think those qualities were difficult because they made you hard to manage. She waited. I understand now, he said, that we had that backward. Those qualities were difficult because we didn't know what to do with them. That's a different problem. She looked at the creek while he talked, the way she sometimes looked away from things that were hard to receive directly. I don't expect you to forgive us, he said. I'm not asking for that. I want you to know that I understand what we had and what we did with it. She was quiet for a long moment. The water moved. Somewhere in the pines on the far bank, a bird was making a sound she had been hearing all spring and still hadn't identified. I'm not withholding forgiveness, she said. I'm still working out what I feel. There are parts that are clear and parts that aren't. She looked at him. I think that's honest. It is, he said. What you did in that study, she said, the words specifically, those will take longer. She paused. But I'm not carrying them the way I was when I left. They have less weight than they did. He nodded. He didn't say anything else, which was right. They rode back to the ranch in the clear morning light, and the distance between them was not the distance of two people who had resolved everything, because they hadn't. It was the distance of two people who had looked at the actual shape of the thing between them and had, separately and together, decided to be honest about it, rather than paper over it with something easier. That was, Elena thought, more than she had expected to get from her father's visit, possibly more than he had expected to give. He left on a Thursday morning, the same hired wagon waiting at the gate, the mountain spring fully underway around them now. Grass coming in on the lower pastures, the high slopes still carrying snow but losing it in long silver lines as the temperature climbed each afternoon. Her mother had sent something with him. She found out at the last moment when he reached into the bag he'd been carrying and produced a wrapped parcel that she recognized before she even opened it. The size and weight of it, the particular way the cloth was folded. The silver-backed brushes from her grandmother. She held the parcel and looked at her father. She sent them herself, he said. She wouldn't let me pack them. She wrapped them herself, the night before I left. Elena looked down at the parcel in her hands. She thought about her mother in the Whitmore house, sitting in the parlor with her needlework, thinking. Getting up in the evening to find the brushes and wrap them herself because there was no direct route to what she wanted to say. And this was the indirect one she had chosen. She thought about the sentence in her father's letter. Your mother sends her regards and says she hopes the winter was not too hard. She had been right. Her mother had been sitting and thinking. Tell her thank you, Elena said. Her voice was level. Tell her I'll write soon. A longer letter. Her father nodded. He looked at her for a moment. The look of a man committing something to memory because he understood the value of it. Elena, he said. She looked at him. The agreement will work, he said. I'll make it work. I know, she said. That's why we made it. He climbed into the wagon. She stood at the gate with the parcel under one arm and watched the wagon go down the road toward the pine stand, and she watched until it was through the trees and gone. And then she stood for another moment in the quiet that followed. Caleb came and stood beside her. She sent the brushes, Elena said. He looked at the parcel. He looked at her face. Are you all right? He said. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. Yes, she said. I think I am. She went inside and set the parcel on the desk in her room and didn't open it immediately. She would open it later when she was ready for what it would make her feel, which she was fairly certain was something she didn't have a clean name for yet. The things her mother communicated indirectly were always like that. They required time to translate. The summer that followed was the first full season Elena had experienced in the North, and it turned out to be its own education, distinct from what winter and spring had taught her. Summer in the Northern Territory was short and serious about itself. The light lasted until nearly 10 at night, a quality of extended afternoon that took weeks to adjust to, and the work expanded into the longer days the way water expands into available space, filling the hours with a density of activity that made even the hardest months before seem measured. The cattle moved to the high summer pasture. The water agreement's maintenance schedule operated on different requirements. The first delivery under the Southern Market arrangement went out in July. 40 head, traveling south with a drover Caleb had used before, accompanied by documentation that Elena had prepared and a letter of introduction from Richard Whitmore to the stockyard operator in the first southern county. She knew the delivery had arrived when the confirmation letter came back 2 weeks later, written in the stockyard operator's hand, addressed jointly to Caleb Wilder and Elena Wilder. She had not told anyone to address her that way in any correspondence. She had simply been present in all the documents, and the operator had drawn his own conclusion. She showed it to Caleb without comment. He read it. "The delivery was received in good condition," he said. "Yes," she said, "and the pricing held. Your father's introduction worked." "His introduction and your cattle," she said. He set the letter down. He looked at her in the way he sometimes looked at her now, that had a quality different from the first months. Not the assessment of those early weeks, not the recalibration of the middle period, but something that had settled, as though the man looking at her had finally stopped being surprised and had arrived at something that was simply true. "We should expand the herd," he said, "if the Southern Market holds." "By how much?" "I've been thinking 30 head next spring," he said. "Possibly more if we bring the North pasture back into the rotation properly." She pulled her ledger toward her. "Show me the North pasture numbers." He sat down across from her, and they worked through it the way they had learned to work through things. Not always smoothly, arguing sometimes about the right approach, neither of them inclined to concede a point they thought they were right about, which made the conclusions they reached together more reliable than anything either of them would have arrived at alone. Nora Hargrove came by in August with news and tea and the particular expression of someone who had been waiting to deliver something in person rather than in a letter. The news was that Garrett Cole had sold his property. Elena looked up from the wool she had been working with, which was a skill she had been developing with Nora's instruction, and that she was still bad at in a way she found periodically infuriating. "Sold," she said. "To a family from the eastern settlements," Nora said. "The Prestons. Edmund knows the father slightly. Good people, apparently. They're planning to run sheep on the south section, which will actually help with the grass management on the boundary." "When did this happen?" "Completed last week," Nora said. "Cole's gone south. I don't think he's coming back." Elena set down the wool. She thought about Cole, whom she had never spoken to directly, who had tried to take 80 acres of land through a legal technicality and had failed, and had then spent months making noise about it in Ridgeton. She felt, finding out he was gone, less than she had expected to feel. Not satisfaction, particularly. More like the absence of a minor persistent irritant she had stopped consciously noticing until it was removed. "The water agreement boundary markers will need to be shown to the Prestons," she said. "I told Edmund the same thing," Nora said. "He's planning to ride over next week." "I'll come," Elena said. Nora looked at her with the expression that had evolved over the months from the assessment of her first visit into something that was simply affection. The particular fond directness of a woman who had decided she liked you and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You know," Nora said, "when you arrived here, I gave you about 6 weeks. Elena looked at her. "Before you'd had enough of the cold and the isolation and the work," Nora said. "I've lived through 3 women who came north expecting one thing and found another. 2 of them went back south inside of a year." "You didn't tell me this at the time," Elena said. "I didn't want to be unkind." "And now?" "And now it's been 14 months, and you've restructured your husband's accounts, built a water management system for the territory, and apparently started a consulting practice," Nora said. "I thought you might be ready to hear that I underestimated you." "Considerably," Elena said. "Yes," Nora said, without apology. "Considerably." They sat with their tea, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at the angle it had now in late summer, different from the sharp winter light, and different again from the flat gray of the deep cold months. Elena had learned, over 14 months, to read the light in this place, to know from the quality of it what the temperature was likely to do and whether the high slopes were going to send weather down into the valley and how many hours of working day remained. She had not known any of this when she arrived. She had not known any of the things she now knew, and the person she had been at that relay station in Mallory Creek, sitting on a bench with her trunk beside her and watching the mountain road, was still recognizably her. The same stubbornness, the same practicality, The same refusal to look away from the actual shape of a thing, but was otherwise a different set of circumstances, a different set of available knowledge, a different set of people in the daily picture. She thought sometimes about that woman on the bench, what she would have told her if telling were possible. Not much that would have been useful. Some things you cannot be told in advance because the information has no frame to attach to until you've lived through enough to build the frame yourself. Otsung. In September, she received a letter from a woman she didn't know, a Mrs. Caroline Ashworth in a settlement 3 territories east, who had heard about the water agreement from a lawyer who had heard about it from Fenn, and who was dealing with a creek management dispute that had been escalating for 2 years and was now threatening to become something that required legal intervention. The letter was long and detailed and showed signs of a woman who was good at organizing information and had been sitting with a problem for a long time without anyone to think through it with. Elena wrote back the same week. The letter she sent was the longest she'd written since the consultation work had begun, because Caroline Ashworth's situation was genuinely different from the others she'd encountered, more complicated in the specific way of disputes that had personal history layered under the practical problem, and the framework that had worked in the Northern Territory would need adaptation to fit a different water system in a different geography. She told Caleb about the letter over dinner. "She's 3 territories east," he said. "Yes. You'd have to correspond for months before she could implement anything." "Probably," Elena said. "The situation is complicated." He looked at her. "Is it the kind of complicated that's interesting or the kind that's just difficult?" She thought about this. It was a distinction he had started making in the past few months that she had come to appreciate. The recognition that not all complexity was the same, and that her particular engagement was reliably higher when the problem had intellectual texture rather than just volume. "Both," she said, "but more interesting." He nodded. "Write back," he said. She had already written back. She told him so. He almost smiled. "I know," he said. "I saw the letter in the outgoing post this morning." "Then why did you tell me to write back?" "Because you like to hear it," he said, with the quiet directness that she had come to understand was his version of warmth. Not demonstrative, not performed, but present, consistently, and without conditions. She looked at him across the table. 14 months ago, she had sat in a wagon going north with a wooden box and a set of tools and a letter from a stranger who had told her the north was cold and the work was hard. She had arrived at a house she didn't know and stood in a kitchen she didn't understand and eaten dinner across from a man she had no basis for trusting, except the 2 pages of honest writing he had sent her and the one thing she had observed in him from a distance years before. She had built something here. Not from nothing. She had never had nothing. That was the lie her family had told themselves, that what she offered was nothing. She had built it from what she had always had, the ability to read a situation clearly, the willingness to do the work that was in front of her without waiting for it to be recognized, the specific courage of someone who had spent so long being underestimated that she had stopped needing other people's estimation to tell her what she was worth, but she had also built it with him. That was the truth she had taken longer to fully see, because she had arrived in the North already complete in a sense, already knowing who she was, already past the worst of what her family's dismissal had done to her. She had not needed Caleb Wilder to tell her she had value. What she had needed, and what she had found without knowing she was looking for it, was someone who could work beside her in a way that neither diminished what she brought nor required her to make herself smaller. That was not a small thing. She had come to understand that it was, in fact, the rare thing, the thing most people spent whole lifetimes looking for and many never found. She was not sentimental about it. She had no illusions about the difficulty that remained. The work was hard and the winters were long, and they disagreed sometimes with a heat that required real effort to navigate. And there were things in her that she was still working out, and things in him that remained opaque to her after 14 months and might remain so. None of that was going away. But she was here. She had made herself here, and she was still making it, and the making itself was the thing that mattered. October came in with the first edge of cold returning to the air, the particular quality of autumn in the north, that was different from the summer cool and from the winter cold, something in between that smelled like pine resin and coming change, and the satisfying weight of work that had been done well enough to carry you through what was ahead. She was at the desk in her room when she heard Caleb's boots on the stairs, an unusual thing, mid-afternoon on a working day, and looked up when he appeared in the doorway. Come outside, he said. I'm in the middle of... It'll wait, he said. She looked at his face. He was not alarmed, not urgent in the way of problems. He had the look of someone who had seen something and wanted her to see it too. She set down her pen and followed him downstairs and out through the kitchen door. He was pointing north. The mountains were doing something she had heard about but not yet witnessed. The first significant snowfall of the coming season on the high peaks, and the light catching it in the late afternoon in a way that turned the upper slopes into something she didn't have adequate language for. The peaks were white against a sky that was still the deep blue of late clear days, and the light on the snow had a quality that was neither warm nor cold, but was simply luminous, as if the mountains were generating their own illumination from inside. She stood beside him and looked at it. It comes every year, he said. The first snow on the peaks. I've never seen it from this yard without thinking I should be showing it to someone. She looked at him. I wanted you to see it, he said. She turned back to the mountains. They stood together in the October afternoon with the cold beginning to come off the high slopes and the light doing what light in that country did. Insisting on itself, refusing to be ordinary, going on until you couldn't look away even if you'd wanted to. She thought about the hallway outside her father's study. She thought about the wagon going north through the mountain passes and the old woman at the relay station who had said the North has a way of telling you what you're made of. She thought about the field copy of the old survey and the kitchen table at midnight, and Nora Hargrove saying, I underestimated you considerably, and her father standing at the creek bend and her mother wrapping the silver-backed brushes herself, in the night, because there was no direct route to what she wanted to say. She thought about what it meant to be wanted, not in the way of something useful that filled a function, but in the specific way of a person whose presence made the thing in front of them, even something as simple as a mountain with the first snow on it, feel like something worth seeing. She had not known that was possible. She had not known because no one had offered it to her before. And a thing you have never received is very difficult to understand from description alone. You had to be standing in the right yard, beside the right person, in the right October afternoon, before you could feel the full weight of it and know what it was. It's beautiful, she said. She said it simply, without reaching for more than that, because it was true, and it was enough. Yes, he said. It is. They stood in the yard until the light changed and the peaks lost their particular luminescence and became simply mountains again, large and permanent against the dimming sky. The cold was real now, coming off the high slopes in earnest. The first preview of what was coming. She would be ready for it. She knew that now, not because she had proven it to herself or to anyone else, but because she had lived through the first one and learned its language and would carry that knowledge into the next and the one after that. That was how it worked. Not a single moment of arrival, but a continuous building, layer by layer, season by season, until the place you had come to as a stranger had so much of your handwork in it that it was inseparable from who you were. She had been the daughter nobody wanted. She had been the woman sent away to be someone else's problem. She had been the plain one, the difficult one, the one with strong hands and no patience for pretense, the one who did the work and got no credit for it, the one standing in a hallway with an account ledger against her chest while her family laughed through a closed door. All of that was still true. It had happened. She was not going to revise it into something more comfortable or more resolved than it actually was. But she was also a woman who had read a land survey and found the error that saved 80 acres of ground, who had built a water system that 7 families depended on, who corresponded with lawyers in 3 territories about frameworks she had developed at a kitchen table in the middle of winter, who had sat across from her father and told him the truth without cruelty and without retreat, who stood here now, in this yard, in this life, in the company of a man who had come out of the barn in the middle of a working afternoon because he had wanted her to see the light on the mountains. The person her family had discarded had turned out to be this person. She had always been this person. That was the thing. Not a transformation, not a becoming, just the slow, patient uncovering of what had been there all along once she was in a place that gave it room. The mountains held the last of the light. The cold deepened. Behind them, the kitchen lamp burned in the window. "Come in," she said. "I'll start dinner." "I'll finish up in the barn," he said. 20 minutes. She turned and walked back to the house, and her boots on the frozen ground made the particular sound of autumn on the threshold of winter, and behind her the mountains went on being what they were, large and indifferent and astonishing. And the smoke from the kitchen chimney went straight up into the still air, which meant no wind tonight, which meant a clear, cold night ahead. And she knew this. She could read this. She was at home in this in a way she had never been at home anywhere before. She went inside. She hung up her coat. She went to the stove. And the northern evening came on the way it always did, completely, without apology, on its own terms. And she moved through her kitchen in the warm amber light and began to make something from what was available, which was, she had come to understand, the only way anything worth keeping was ever built.